Okay, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly Dungeon Muser this evening. This evening, I'm going to do something a little daunting, and I'm going to try and provide an overview and introduction to the second edition of Paizo Publishing's new classic kind of fantasy role-playing game, Pathfinder. This is the second edition of the core rulebook for second edition Pathfinder that just came out recently and will be releasing generally in about 3 days. And this is the bestiary that goes with that as well. Now, at the time of recording, it is about 3 days until the PDFs and the other things have gone out. I got my copies early because I'm a subscriber on the for other stuff for adventure paths and whatnot from Paizo. So I fortunately was able to get mine earlier. I paid for these. They're not a copy that was sent out for a review or anything like that. And one of the things I've noticed in the last, in kind of the lead up towards this, is there's been a really weird response online, particularly on Twitter, to the release of these new books. And I know that at the time of the playtest as well, too, there was a really, to be honest, it wasn't great to go online and try and find out about how people were feeling about this game. So what I decided to do is to shoot this video. We ran the playtest for about 3 months after the playtest came out. With the release of these new books, I've been running this. I've run it 2-3 times now, and I'm really, really, really enjoying it. And what I wanted to do is to give an idea for folks who may be on the fence about this, particularly people who are coming from a background that isn't necessarily heavily invested in Pathfinder or Pathfinder's first edition, to give an idea of just what this game is, to talk about. I mean, to be honest, what I want to do is approach this the way I do all of my introductions, overviews, and reviews, which is to say, I want to talk about the background for this product. I want to talk about the what the game is about. Talk about the core mechanic. Who do you play in the game? What do you do in the game? What's in the core rulebook? And then I'll conclude with who's this for. And the way I want to approach this is before I launch into that, I want to give you a little background about me so you understand the perspective. Obviously, anyone who is going to be approaching a game is coming from a certain perspectives. So I want you to understand where I'm coming from and why I feel the way I do about this. But the short version of this is that I really, really, really enjoy this game. I think it's got a lot of really, really great ideas. It is extremely fun at the table. And I think there's a lot of promise for where this game might be going. Now, I guess let's maybe start with that. So for me, like I'm not a Pathfinder first edition. I'm not, it's not that I'm not a fan of it. It's just, it is by no means the first game I would choose to run. From my perspective, and I don't mean this as a way of just shitting on Pathfinder first, or to be honest, any other comparator game I'm going to talk about here. But Pathfinder 1 for me was just, there was too much stuff into it. I felt like the game felt to me like there was a set of rules, and then that was the way you ran it, more so than almost any other role-playing game that I've encountered. That felt like there was one way to run Pathfinder 1E, and that was to run it rules as written, because the amount of decisions and math and stuff like that goes into people or players building their characters, it relies on certain rules functioning the way they were. It's a very intricate lattice where if you change things and whatnot, it could make for a suboptimal experience. For me, that was just too much. Now, it's not to say that I didn't purchase all of the stuff for Pathfinder First Edition. I was a subscriber to the Adventure Pass because I think they're terrific. And even though I don't run or didn't run Pathfinder 1, I still love the products from Paizo. And I have all of the books as well, too, all the core rule books, both in the tiny little versions that are out now and the hardcover, because I like a lot of the material that's in there. It was very easy to repurpose that stuff. It's just Pathfinder 1 itself was never my go-to game. And when I recently tried to run the game on the channel, I once again hit up against it just being, it was not the game for me. It did not fit my sensibilities. Where my sensibilities typically lie is more with old school games, with a particular favorite of mine right now is Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, which is a old school game that plays like a cleaned up version of AD&D or AD&D Second Edition. I also have had a great deal of fun with D&D Fourth Edition. I was a huge fan of that, and I ran it for years and years. And I would never go back to that now. I cannot help but see it as just too much of a tactical gamist kind of thing. But that's one of I didn't like that aspect of it now, but I did love it for a number of years. And there's a number of things about Fourth Edition that I really love, and I'm going to talk about over the course of our discussion about Pathfinder 2nd. I also run, I've been running now for about 7 months, Starfinder. And Starfinder, if you're not familiar with it, is Paizo's science fantasy role-playing game. All right, sweetie. Sorry, my dog's very excited about Starfinder as well. And the reason I mentioned Starfinder as well, Starfinder is... Okay, sweetie. They heard you. Emily, come here. Come on. Sorry, folks. So Starfinder has made some changes from the core mechanics of Pathfinder, where it set up so a lot of things were set keyed to the level of the characters. You know, what was important was comparing to determine difficulties was comparing levels of various things, whether it was an affliction or whether it was a hazard or whether it was another adversary. And that felt very Fourth Edition to me. Fourth Edition was it was set to parity. You always compared how difficult things were really in relation to where your characters were. And the idea was with Fourth is that to always keep things, a range of... Honey. All right, Emmy. Emmy. All right, well, you're just going to have to deal with that. I apologize. She's very happy or very upset, one or the other. So the way that Starfinder worked was very different from Pathfinder. Pathfinder had a agnostic kind of, its difficulties were not necessarily set to levels. It wasn't really, the way that you managed difficulties was not necessarily through the lens of where your character is standing, that often played out that way. Like you would, encounter, make combat encounters and so forth that would be set to be something that was reasonable to your level, but it didn't really feel like everything was through the lens of your character, Starfinder definitely does that, and like if you, it takes it to a greater degree too, where the items and stuff like that, they have keyed levels as well too. So Starfinder felt like a step towards that, and then we got Pathfinder and the Pathfinder 2nd Edition playtest, I should say. And the Pathfinder 2nd Edition playtest, the thing that was interesting for me, or what interested me about it in the first place, well, I mean, it was a new game, so I was curious to see what was going on with it. It also came out, I believe, 2 years after the D&D 5th Edition game came out. And I've run a fair amount of D&D 5th Edition, but it really is not my game either. I don't want to, again, just make this just bitching about different versions of it. But for me, the thing I particularly didn't like about D&D 5th is that it felt, I don't know. I mean, it felt like a halfway step. Like if I want to play an old school game with simplified characters and streamlined rules and things like that, I can play an old school version of D&D. Or if I want to play a more complicated game, I could play something like Pathfinder, where I've got lots of options to ways of making decisions on the character side. Because that's definitely something that Pathfinder First Edition excelled at, is that as the players, you had a wealth of character options that you could use. Things that you could do to customize your character. The mini game about making your character was a very rich and complex thing. But unfortunately, that tended to spill over into the DM side of the equation, because the DM, to make their characters or their NPCs or whatnot, they had to continually engage with that. So it made it a pretty difficult task to throw together monsters unless you were using some kind of, computer program. Starfinder made the decision to change that so that the rules that create adversaries, and that's any kind of NPC, whether it's a scary alien or whether it's a airsats version of a stormtrooper, all of that is built by a very different set of rules than what the players did. And the clever thing there was that it put the complexity all on the side of the players, so the players had a very, interesting and complex game to interface with. But for the DMs, it was pretty easy, and it remains. I mean, I find Starfinder an extraordinarily easy game to run because I can wing stuff very easily, as easily as what I can in my old school games, where there is a very, very little complexity. Now, the reason I'm talking about all that stuff is because a lot of those things are the reasons I'm attracted to those particular games. And I have found that I find a lot of that in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So take what I say, going forward on this from that perspective. I'm someone who does enjoy old school play because of the way the rules just kind of get out of the way. I enjoy the pace of play with old school play, where it doesn't bog down with a lot of like discussions of math and so forth, and how easy it is to just improvise stuff at the table. I also really enjoy Starfinder because Starfinder gives a lot of options, where D&D 5th, I feel, yes, you do get a great deal of creativity when you're making your character at the start, but after that, it really feels like you're making a decision at level 3 or level 2, depending on what class you are, where you're going to go in terms of your archetype or whatever they call it, or school or whatever. And then once you go on, it's, you get to pick some spells if you're a spellcaster. You might be able to pick some class abilities, but it doesn't feel like there's a great deal of specialization. Now, that might seem stupid for someone who's just said they like a old school game where you're making really no class decisions. But as I said, for me, the feeling is it's kind of a halfway point. If I want to just like ignore and not have character option, I can play an old school game. If I want to have a depth and wealth of options, I would prefer there be more than what there is in 5th edition. So for me, 5th edition was just not, I have run it a bunch of different times. I don't feel like it's not a game that I really, it's not something that I enjoy all that much. But so take that again as the perspective that I feel there's not enough game there, I guess, for 5th edition. So what is Pathfinder 2nd? So Pathfinder 2nd is best thought of as a completely new game, and I don't want to, it may be controversial to say that this to me feels like what 4th edition was, where 4th edition D&D, where it's a very different game. Like the designers for Pathfinder 2nd edition, the people at Paizo, it feels like they set up, a clean whiteboard and said, nothing has to stay. Everything is open for change and open for reinterpretation. So let's see what game we would want to build, and we'll base that on some of the challenges or hurdle or problems, I guess, that they identified in previous editions. So let's talk about this game. So that's the background with which they went to the playtest. From the time, if you're familiar with the playtest, and I shot a video about the playtest as well too, they have made changes in a number of different areas from that time until this. So there may be, if you're familiar with the playtest and you didn't really dig it for whatever reason, particularly if you didn't like Resonance did not make it into the final edition. If you're not familiar, Resonance was this thing to track uses of magic item that felt kind of cumbersome and really only felt natural when it was paired with the Alchemist class, which did feel pretty cool. In the final version of this, it doesn't exist anymore. They changed the way that the bonuses work from training. They changed the way death mechanics work, and there's a number of other little small things that were changed as well. That I'll try and touch on those as we go through. But what I would encourage you to do is think of this as a brand new game. Don't think of this as I didn't like Pathfinder first, so therefore I won't like this. The thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about, the scuttlebutt, as it were, around the friendly local gaming store is like, who's this for? And to be honest, I was kind of in that boat. Like but before the playtest came out, I'm like, what? Like, who is this going to be for? There are all these people playing D&D 5th, and then I got the playtest and I loved it. Like it hit so many markings for me, or so many things that I really enjoyed about games. I enjoy speed of play. I enjoy interesting decisions at the table rather than on the character sheet. But I also want, with my experience with Starfinder, I like the players having interesting decisions on the player side too, just so long as it doesn't complicate things on my end. Well, they've done everything that I liked about Starfinder and gone even further with this. So before we dive into the actual mechanics and whatnot too, let's just talk about some of the what I think are the assumptions that they made with this. So one of the things that I feel like they did is that they kept from a previous edition is the wealth of options. I think that Paizo knew that one of their strengths with their game was that you had so many different interesting decisions to make in the course of making and playing and seeing your character advance. Like you did get to make a lot of interesting ways where you could tweak your characters so that mechanically at the table, they felt very different from what other characters were. But one of the things that Pathfinder 1 did not necessarily do that D&D 5th did that was interesting was that when you took a feat, it change the options that your character could do. Rather than just getting a strict modifier to certain things, or a new spell or something like that. And I'm being vastly overcomplicating. I know that Pathfinder 2 had a lot more than, or Pathfinder 1 had more than just that. But what they've done in Pathfinder 2nd is that for every feat, and I'm going to talk about different kinds of feats, because there are ancestral feats, there are ancestry feats, class feats, skill feats, general feats, and did I get them all? Is that right? I think those are the 4. It's best to think of them as abilities, because it is the vast minority of them that actually provide just flat mechanical bonuses. And the only ones I can think of offhand are initiative and increasing your speed. There are 2 general feats that do each of them does one of those 2 things. Apart from that, each feat gives you some new thing to do. And the thing I find that's interesting about that is it does give you that same satisfaction of being able to customize your character the way you could in Pathfinder 1, but rather than just like tweaking the math and whatnot, what it does is it increases the amount of things in your toolbox. So that is one definite decision that they made. They also have split up, very similar to what they did with Starfinder and what 5th edition did as well. Your character is built on 3 different tiers. So you have your ancestry, what used to be called race, your background, and your class. And each of those 3 things has an ongoing effect on your character. The background, not so much. The background the background is a decision you make, but it doesn't have any mechanical effect on your character going forward. But your class and your ancestry do. As you go up in levels, you will pick new feats from each of those 2 different sources. And that shapes, and as I said, it's not just like flat modifiers, it's things that will shape what your character is capable of doing. So the interesting thing in that sense is that it feels like it expands your character out rather than up. So instead of just getting, certain spikes in bonuses that you do with certain things, and again, I'm vast, this may be an unfair overcharacterization of what Pathfinder 1 was like, but this game, it really feels like I'm making interesting, meaningful decisions where the abilities that I'm gaining are defining who that character is in my mind, and also will affect how I'm able to interface with the fiction when I'm playing that character at the table. Another core mechanic is that they took the sort of the breakdown of gameplay of D&D 5th, where they broke it down into combat, exploration, and role-playing. And what they've done is they've divided the game into specific segments as well, too. There is the encounter phase, which is tactical combat. There is the exploration phase, which is sort of a middle ground between that and like a full day passing by. These can be segments as short as 10 minutes. They can be things as long as like a day's long of travel. And then there's also the downtime phase. And within each of those different phases, there's different ways you can play out things. So you can, in the tactical phase, obviously, it's a combat encounter, and we'll talk about that a little later. The encounter phase, though, is sort of all the different things you'll be doing between combat. Like it's the exploring the dungeon. It's, looking around town, trying to find a contact. It's trying to curry favor with a certain magistrate. It's, trying to find a path through a swamp or something like that. Trying to track down a source of magic energy that may be spawning some kind of unholy thing. It gives you some neat tools and actions to gamify that sort of middle ground. And for me, it reminds me a lot of, in some ways, the old Wilderness Survival Guide. And regular viewers of my channel will know that I love that. It's an old AD&D product that gave specific, like, gamified rules for traveling overland in AD&D. What the exploration phase seems to do is to provide a lot of that. And if you're more familiar with Pathfinder 1, you can think of sort of all the things that expanded out exploration in Wilderness or Ultimate Wilderness and Ultimate Intrigue for social stuff. That's the region where all of those actions will happen, and then there's the downtime phase, which is going through the days. One of the things downtime reminds me as well, too. One of the things that they seem to want to do with this edition as well is embrace yes. So, and by that, I mean that there's so many cool ways to mix and match stuff in this. You can well, let me rephrase that. It's not that you can you can't multi-class anymore. What you can do is instead take these types of feats called archetypes that replace some class feats to give you powers from other classes. And it's very modular. It's not like you just start getting automatic things. You can pick and choose what things you want to get, which, to be honest, reminds me a lot of the way 4th edition D&D did it. But this is a much more modular approach to it than what 4th edition did. In addition, I think that's how they're going to handle Paragon paths or prestige classes, rather, not Paragon paths. Prestige classes, I imagine, are going to be built that way too. The book that has the first batch of those is not out yet. It's not going to be out for a couple of months, but it seems like that's probably the way they're going to build that as well. What you can also do is there is, in the downtime rules, there are express rules for retraining feats. So the way that I say that there's more ways to say yes is you can actually, if you take a feat and it's just proving to be suboptimal or whatever, you can just spend a week in downtime and retrain. And there's clear rules for that. Now, some people may have done that in regular play anyway, but it's cool them setting that out in the rules as well. Default character creation is it's sort of a middle ground between the point buy stuff that was in Pathfinder 1 and 3rd edition D&D and the way it works in Starfinder, which is you just pick a number of like what are called boosts. It's bonuses to your attributes. And in that way, you do really get to sort of build specifically the character that you want for it. So the overall, I guess the overall approach that they seem to be with this is they really want to keep the degree of interesting decisions that you make about your character that they had in 1st edition, but they really have done a very seemingly thorough effort to wipe out as much of that like math stuff as possible. They clearly took the sort of the teasing of Mathfinder to heart on it, and they've made some substantial changes to how math works in the game as well, in the sense that it's really baked into your stats and into your level and your proficiency. Like, so maybe I'm starting to get into some of the specifics of this. Let's start talking about the what the game is about. So Pathfinder 2nd, just like the first one, is going to be is a game of like heroic fantasy. So this is not a game for like earthy, gritty, low fantasy kind of gameplay. This is a game of traditional D&D style epic fantasy. You have elves and dwarves and fighters and clerics and whatnot. So all of the signature classes that were in the 1st edition of Pathfinder are present in this one, with the addition of the Alchemist. And in addition to adding the Alchemist, they've also added a new playable race, which is the Goblins. And Pathfinder Goblins, it's a cool decision, not only because, World of Warcraft certainly taught us that people love playing goblins. It's also that goblins were kind of like the signature monster for Pathfinder 1st edition. If there was a mascot that could be said to have for Pathfinder 1, it's their goblins. And part of that is because when Paizo started publishing their own materials too, I think Burnt Offerings was the first adventure in the Rise of the Rune Lords, their first adventure path. And that thing had a whole bunch of really neat stuff about goblins that really told you how goblins were different in Pathfinder from any other setting. And they had a very distinctive look to them too. This big kind of like football-shaped head. So it's cool that they added those characters in. In addition, it does seem like goblins are really, really popular. I've had at least 2 players who have jumped on the option of playing goblins too, because like they're just adorable little guys. Look at those guys. Who doesn't want to play that? So anyway, all the other traditional D&D races that you'd find in classic D&D, elves, dwarves, gnomes, halflings, what else? Humans, obviously, and I think that's it. Those are all present. And then, interestingly, the humans are where you go. You start as a human, and then you build a half elf or a half orc as a heritage from one of those things. So we'll talk about that in a moment when we start talking about the actual components for building your character. The core mechanic remains the same as in previous editions. D20 is what you're using to resolve all of your tasks, and it's going to be some other kinds of dice that you're going to be using for effect for your tasks. So if you hit with a weapon or a spell or something like that, you're going to roll a number of different kinds of dice, D6s, D8s, whatever. That's going to be what your effect is. One of the interesting changes is they've introduced an expanded range of critical successes and critical failures for pretty much every action. And it may very well be every action. In addition to getting a critical success on a roll of a nat 20, you also get a critical success if you beat the target number by 10. And conversely, if you failed your roll by 10 or more, then you get a critical failure. And every skill in the game has defined, depending on what action you're doing, usually has a defined crit success effect, crit failure effect. But it also is kind of fun in gameplay to be narrating what that consequence is. And crit effects on attacks are just double damage now. Now, there are other things that may trigger as well. Depending on the spell or weapon trait, there might be something else that happens. And weapon specialization gives you access to certain kinds of critical effects, too, that is dependent on the type of weapon you're using. So what that does is it allows axes to feel different at the table. Not only when you don't crit, but especially when you crit, there's some neat thing that happens. The traits that were in first edition Pathfinder have been carried over into this and expanded so that they have ongoing meaningful tactical benefits. So say, fighting with an axe definitely feels different mechanically than fighting with a spear, whether you're a weapon specialist or not. And the crit fumbles, I guess another thing too is that in addition to crit fumbles and whatnot too, there is a mechanic called hero points that's in this. And if you were familiar with the playtest, that was there as well, but they've streamlined it. Now you have a maximum of 3 hero points. You start with your game with 1. It can be spent to re-roll the dice roll, or you can spend all of your hero points to not die. And we'll talk about the dying mechanics a little later. And you can, the DM is expected to hand out 1 hero point on average about 1 an hour, depending on, how dangerous the scene is. You might want to accelerate that to 1 every half hour or slow it down if not. But to be honest, with having run it with hero points for quite a while now, they don't feel unbalanced. Like it feels like that's a fun way to make the characters feel different. And, from the riffraff and whatnot. It's a good way to, without making them, superhumans. Let's see. I think that's it for the core mechanic. That is one substantial difference from every other D20 game, is incorporating this intentional range of higher and lower crit successes, crit failures is pretty different from previous versions, and it has a substantial effect on the game, but in really interesting ways. I mentioned that Pathfinder 2nd had another sort of key core mechanic is that things are keyed to your level. Like when you look through the bestiary, one of the things you'll notice is that there's not an XP listing for there. And in addition, they changed the way that they classify monsters too in terms of their difficulty. They're actually calling them levels now. And it has it's got a subtle effect on how you're calculating things, because instead of a challenge rating or challenge level or whatever you want to call it, it's a level. It's just a flat level. So it is clearly intuitive. If you're making an NPC to fight in, against your players, you don't need to do any kind of shell game to translate that into challenge rating. A level 5 druid is a level 5 adversary. And if you choose to slap on a template to it, like you want to make them a grave knight or a vampire or a ghoul or a ghost, you just adjust the levels according to what's in the bestiary. The way that level thing works, though, is that you look at your character's levels, or the party level, if there's at different levels, the average party level, and then monsters or adversaries that are up to 4 levels higher or up to 4 levels lower, that's your range of things you're using in the game. And the I think it's intended, well, not I think, I know it's intended because these people playtest the bejesus out of their stuff and they're smart designers. But the really, really cool thing about that is that it makes, because of the critical effect of rolling 10 over, it makes bosses, like if you're fighting a high level monster, a monster that's 3 or 4 levels higher than your party, it feels like a really substantial boss fight. Its defenses are higher, its hit points are more, it can do more damage, and it crits more often. So it's really feels like a tense adversary. And in comparison, the lower level things feel more like minions because you're going to crit more often against them, so you'll be able to blow through them. Plus, you'll be doing more damage. And I'm going to talk a little later about how that works mechanically. But the really, really interesting thing about that is at the table, it feels like there's a lot of other games out there that have, express minion or like boss or sub boss kind of mechanics. Like the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game does that. The 2D20 Modifiers games do that, and 4th edition D&D did that. Feng Shui did that as well. This game does not have to avail itself of that kind of classification. Just by virtue of the way the math works, it feels that way at the table. That's really cool. It's really, really clever. Like I think it might work that way in Starfinder too. To be honest, my players are not high enough level for me to notice that, but it definitely feels that way in here. And it makes for it makes it great because you can keep reusing monsters for a long time because of that pretty fat level range that you've got to, you get to go to for your monsters. Low level things get to stick around for a lot longer. And it also means that you can throw things into encounters earlier on than, like in older versions of a D20 game. At low levels, if you're going to throw something in that's 4 challenge ratings higher, that's potentially a party wipe. Like it's really not good news. But it just makes for a really interesting boss fight. What else here do you need to know about the core mechanic? I think that's probably it. So let's talk about what do you play in this? I mean, obviously you play, traditional, D&D style fantasy adventuring heroes. You play, let's go through the classes in the core rulebook here. There's 12 classes in the core rulebook, and those classes are, of course, Alchemist, Barbarian, Bard, Champion, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, and Wizard. And in each of those classes as well, there are a substantial number of decisions that you make that give you access to different abilities that will further customize that. And beyond just selecting your class feats, which you do as you gain levels as well, which again give you abilities, not just flat bonuses or things like that, or they'll give you, actions. That there are specific decisions you will make for each of them, and each of the classes has a minimum of 3 different options. In a lot of cases, they've got substantially more. Like Barbarians have a massive range of things they can do. There is 7 different types of wizards you can play. There's, I think, like 8 to 10 different types of sorcerers you can play too. And what that means is that even your class selection is enormously varied. But that's not the only thing that is very varied. You come here for quality one-liners like that. The ancestries actually have a number of options for customizing your character beyond just the classes as well, or the feats as well. As I mentioned, you've got ancestry feats, and you'll pick more of those as you gain levels. But you also pick something called a heritage. And the heritage is kind of what sub-races would have been in some other versions of D&D, or like the trait substitutions you would do in Pathfinder 1. As the game expanded, they started adding after the Advanced Player's Guide is when they added the traits option. I think I get my history right here. Advanced Player's Guide. And then they use those traits as ways of sort of like substituting out certain features for your races. Well, that's what your heritage would be, is if you want to play dwarf from a Arctic climb, maybe you're going to pick the what was it called? Oh yeah, here. So like some options for dwarf here. I'll take a. This is what they look like. And for those listening at home who prefer an overview where it's a camera down thing, forgive me. I just find I don't, for myself, I don't like looking at just a page. I prefer seeing someone talk. So I apologize. Let me hear. So here's what the dwarf looks like. So there we go. There's our dwarf sheet here. And then here's the list of heritages. So things like Ancient Blooded Dwarf, or which gives you this Call of Ancient Blood ability or reaction. And you can see that little swoopy arrow there. That tells me that that is a reaction. And we'll talk about that, the action economy, in a little bit here. There's, the Death Warden Dwarf, the Forged Dwarf, and there's a number of these as you go along. And as you can imagine, a lot of these fit sort of what the sub-races would be in previous versions or other, D&D type games, where you'd be like a Wood Elf or like a, Deep Gnome or something like that. In addition, what you get from your ancestry is you get a set of hit points. Your hit points are now determined partly by your ancestry and partly by your class. And that's only at first level. Once you start gaining levels, it's just your class that dictates what your hit points are. But what the combination does is it gives your character at first level a bit more of a cushion. You're not quite as fragile as you are in first edition Pathfinder or in some other versions of D&D. So you really can have a bit more of an up and down fight without like one solid hit from a kobold taking you down right away. Hit points are flat numbers in this edition too, very much like what they are in Starfinder and what they were in 4th edition D&D as well. Each of your ancestries gives you minimum 2 boosts and sometimes a flaw as well, which is a -2 to your attribute. So they still carried over the idea that certain ancestry or like racial pairings will give you a penalty to certain attributes. But what you end up doing is over the course of creating your character, you'll pick boosts from your ancestry. You'll pick boosts at your background. You'll pick one, or you'll get 1 boost, or sometimes have a choice of 2 from your class. And then you will make 4 extra boosts. And at each of those stages, you can't double up on it. But what it does allow you to do is, even if your character is suboptimal at something, you usually can find a way to kind of, to have a decent score. You won't have the 18 that you ideally can start with, which is the max you can start with in the game. But it means that you're not overly penalized for playing, say, like if a dwarf has a flaw for charisma, you're not going to, playing a dwarf bard is not overly suboptimal choice. In addition, as I said, as you gain levels, you will buy, or not get by, but you will be able to select new feats. And again, like new abilities, so new feats as you go along. And what it reminds me of is the way that the ancestry keeps having an effect on your character as much as the class does, is it feels like Shadow of the Demon Lord. If you're familiar with that game, it's a really terrific game, first off, if you're not familiar with it, from Robert Schwab. It's worth checking out. But it feels like there's a lot of ideas that were made, or that come from that game, where all the different components, all the different tiers that make up your character, they continue to have an effect on your character as you go along. So the fact that you are an elf, or the fact that you are a dwarf, it continues to matter and have an effect on what your character can do as you go up in levels. And I like that. I like that a lot. Anything that where the mechanics are supporting and kind of, what's going on here? Supporting your decisions or the fiction. I think all of that stuff is great. I mean, it's what you call ludonarrative harmony. It's where the story told by your mechanics is the same thing as the story you're telling in the fiction. So anyway, so that's a substantial change, but it makes for the decisions that you make in terms of your ancestry, it makes it have a persisting effect. There's lots of other interesting decisions that you get to make as your character gains levels. I mentioned as well that the half-orc, excuse me, and the half-elf are heritages of the humans. Well, in place of like the dwarf different options that are there, 2 of the options you can pick for humans are half-elf or half-orc. And I haven't seen them yet, but I imagine that any other kind of hybrid race that might come in future, like the Aasimar or the Tiefling or whatnot, that might be how they're going to do that as well. It's just it's your heritage. So, and then there are still there are feats as you go up that you can only select if you're a half elf. But what it does is it allows it allows you to play on the specific, I guess, half-blooded nature of those races, where they can pick some of the mechanical choices that humans get to pick later on, right? So, as I mentioned, the selections you make for your feats later on, they have a continued mechanical effect on your character. That ancestry allows you to sort of mix and match as you go, so you can feel kind of more like an elf, or more like a human, or just like a half-elf, depending on what you want to pick. So I think that's another way that they just gave lots of great ways for you to keep making interesting decisions that don't just increase your what do you call it, your flat numbers. Your backgrounds are somewhat similar to how backgrounds are in D&D 5th, but they sort of feel more seeing what the first two adventures are like. At the time of recording, that Paizo has just released the player's guide for their first adventure path, which is let's say Age of Ashes. And the player's guide for that and their first adventure, The Fall of Plaguestone, they include a bunch of new backgrounds that link the characters directly to the adventure or to the adventure path. So if you are familiar with the previous Pathfinder adventure paths, then the way that they used to use traits for the different campaigns, and if you're not familiar with it, what they would do is for each adventure path, when the new 6-part module would come out, they'd publish something for players, and in that you would be able to pick some traits, these little small, like kind of like half feats that you could pick that would give you little tweaks to your character that would tie you in purportedly to the campaign. Well, these backgrounds, having that as the way to tie you into the adventure or the adventure path is awesome, because some of these ones are really, really good. Like the ones from Hell Knight Hill is the first adventure in this. And there's an order in the Pathfinder setting called the Hell Knights. Well, one of the backgrounds, as an example of one that ties into a story, this campaign is obviously all about, Hell Knights and whatever, but one of the backgrounds you can pick for it is Hell Knight Scholar. You're someone who just happens to be either a part of it and studying the stuff or whatever. And what the background gives you is one choice of an attribute boost that comes from one of two things. You always have two options, and then one you can put to any stat. You also get a skill from your background, and you get a skill feat. I mentioned before that there are general feats and skill feats too. We'll talk about the difference between those as we get a little further into this. But the backgrounds that are in the core rulebook are pretty cool. And I think, and it's very easy to figure out how you would make your own. Some examples of backgrounds that are in here are, pretty classic tropes like acolyte or, criminal or, martial discipline. But there's some really inventive and kind of more role-playing oriented ones like barkeep or barrister, bounty hunter, hermit, gambler, like tinker, and each of these is the idea of what the background represents is supported by the skill feat. And what skill feats are, I'll talk more about them in detail afterwards, but what a skill feat is you basically have to have a skill in it, and then it usually gives you a new way to use that skill. And either that will be, it will make things easier in terms of it takes you less time, it's a quicker action to do that stuff, or it'll give you new options. One of my favorites it's a higher level one, but one of the intimidation skill feats is called Scare to Death. And it does exactly what it sounds like. You can just intimidate certain people, and if they get a crit failure on their save, and remember, crit failure is not just a 1, it's 10 less. You scare them to death. They have to make a fort save or they die. And that's awesome. Like if you're playing a big scary barbarian and you're a higher level thing and you're facing a bunch of goblins, like, yeah, you could fight your way through those things. Or you could scare them to death, which is a pretty badass way to make your character feel, not only feel like a badass, but also to make them feel like they've got something that is special. That's an action they can do that is different from anybody else without having to just give you mechanical bonuses, So, and that's just one example of the really, really cool options that I think that you have the ability to pick as you gain levels. The classes as well. So the things that you're picking in your classes, I think you will find with, in comparison to other D&D games too, all the classes feel like they've got a lot of skills. Like you don't feel that you are, if the skills reflect what your characters, like the wealth of their experience when you get those characters to the table, I feel like the characters feel more convincing as characters with a wealth of experience in this than they did in Pathfinder 1 and 3.5, particularly like low intelligence fighters. Low intelligence fighters previously would get 2 skills, and which meant that you were basically you had 2 things that you were good at, and more often than not, you would dump those into the things you're going to use, like jumping and climbing or swimming or something like that, things that fighters use. So you could absolutely make other decisions, but the mechanics, that was a suboptimal choice for you. That is not the case in this. You get a lot of skills. And the way that skills are measured in this is you don't have skill points anymore, which is a change from Pathfinder 1 and 3.5. But it's not just, the proficient, thing from 5th edition. What you track is your level of proficiency in skills. And the level of proficiency is actually cut across all the different sort of task resolution things. So any attacks, whether they're spell attacks or martial attacks or weapon attacks or whatever, your saving throws, which are the same as in previous versions of Pathfinder. It's fortitude, will, and reflexes. Your armor, like how you calculate your armor class, whether you're wearing no armor, whether you're wearing heavy armor or whatever, and your weapon attacks. And your skills. They are all measured in this kind of like 5-tier system. You are either untrained, which means that all you get to add to your bonus is your stat. Whatever the relevant stat is for that particular roll, you get to add that, but nothing else. You can be trained, which means you get to add +2 and you get to add your level. So that's the big gap between someone who doesn't know anything about something and someone who is capable. In addition, there are certain actions that require you to have a certain level of proficiency. We'll talk about setting DCs a little later as we go through the book, but that plays into that level of training as well. So there's trained, then there is expert, master, and legendary. And that tracks everything. That tracks your skills, like I said, all those different things. And if you're an expert, you get to add your level plus your stat +4. And it might seem at first like, oh, that's an awful lot of math to go up. I saw someone on Twitter complaining about how, like, look at this formula. Like, God, it's so confusing to how to calculate this. And I feel that's such a disingenuous criticism because, in most games, you're going to have to do math at some point, and you're not doing that every round. You will have those bonuses calculated. And because it is so intuitive, because it's your stat plus if you're trained in it, your level +2, then that is really easy to figure out what bonuses should be when players try and do something different. So, we had it in our sessions we've played so far where players have just decided to pick up another weapon, or they decided to fight, unarmed. I had one player who was grappling with a owl bear and decided to try and punch it in its head. And we didn't have it on his character sheet, but it was easy to figure out what the bonus was because it's a pretty simple, mechanic to figure out. Another thing that's really interesting about that whole trained, expert, master, legendary is that in previous versions of, the previous version of Pathfinder and 3.5 and in Starfinder even, there are some things that have flat stats, like it's a flat difficulty for what something is. If you're familiar with those earlier editions, to break bars or bend gates or bend bars, lift gates, that kind of stuff, it had a set DC, or like certain quality of locks would have a flat DC. It wouldn't matter with a level, it just a 30 or whatever the heck it was. Well, in this, they take advantage of that trained expert, master, legendary rubric, and that's where you set your flat DCs. So if something is a master task, it'll have a certain DC to it, and that's just, it's flat, that number. If it is something that is contested, though, then it is keyed off of the level. So that's usually when you're contesting against someone where there isn't an obvious bonus. This game also introduces a concept called difficulty class. And I know that's been in previous versions of Pathfinder and D&D as well, but it extends it out to everything. And the idea being is that anytime two people are contesting against each other, there's only going to be one person rolling the dice. So if you are trying to sneak against someone, let's say the DM asks you to make a stealth roll, you're going to roll your d6 and then add whatever your appropriate modifier is. And that will be against someone who might spot you 10 plus their perception modifier. So, and conversely, if let's say you started stealthing, this is the way I was running it. If you start stealthing, then if there's an opportunity for the other thing, there's a reason why they would be able to make a stealth check or a perception check. Then they will roll their perception plus 1d6 or 1d20 against your 10 plus your stealth. And similarly, there's certain things like, social skills might work against your will save DC, where if you're trying to convince someone, an NPC, it'll be against their will save bonus plus 10. And that's, I think that's a really clever way to just put it in the hands, put the spotlight on who is important in that action, right? And it also allows the players to take advantage of that the hero point mechanic. So because they are the ones who are going to be rolling most often. It allows them to have agency over how the story plays out to a degree. I mean, like, they're still going to be subject to the vagaries of dice rolls, but it does put the a little bit more agency in the hands of the players for it, and puts the spotlight on the success or failure of the player's action, rather than having to do some contested roll where, like, say the player rolls like, I got a 15, that's awesome, and I got my bonus and blah, 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 and then the DM rolls a nat 20 on the contested roll. It's great that that's gone. So the classes, what they give you is, as I said, your hero points, or your hit points per level, which is a flat amount plus your Constitution modifier. They will set your proficiencies for all of those different things, from your attacks to your saves to your skills to whatever. Your skills will, you'll be able to pick your different skills as well. There's a great kind of front page for each of the classes as well that gives you a big, beautiful colored thing from Wayne Reynolds. And then it gives you an idea of what the class does. Now, that's obviously not going to be, super helpful. It's the expert players or, veterans of RPGs or whatnot. You're probably not going to read that stuff. But for new players, it makes it really easy to read and easy to understand what you're doing. What your character's role is in the different scenes. And one of the things I do love a lot is it tells you expressly for each of the classes what you're doing during combat encounters, during social encounters, while exploring, and in downtime. And then it talks about what you might want to do in the game, and others probably think of you as some other way. Now, the others think of you as just kind of a role-playing thing, but I really like that they give you an idea of what you can do. Some players don't need that. They, a good example is pre-made packs, right? Pre-generated kits. I've got some players in my groups who fucking hate them. They hate the idea, like, well, don't tell me what equipment to pick. I'll pick my own stuff. I'll buy my own stuff. And I feel like that's kind of missing the point that, like, it doesn't mean you have to take that. It means that if you don't want to make the decision for it, you can just pick that stuff. Like for me, I fall definitely in that camp. I don't really care. And if I'm throwing together NPCs or pre-gens, it's nice having that stuff. And for this is a pretty handy thing to prompt their, the player's imagination. And I like that it's for every single class as well, too. So, you're not thinking like, oh, I'm a fighter, so I can't do anything during social encounters. Like, no. It tells you there are things that you can do because you've got more skills in this game, like, and not by, I don't mean like, more skill points or there's a bigger list of skills. I mean, your particular character will have more things that they are mechanically competent at, which means that you're going to be able to participate in more parts of the game. And I love that. I think that's great. It allows everyone, gets a good laugh out of when players, player characters do things that they are not good at. But I mean, letting players actually do stuff that they're good at too is pretty cool. And giving specific advice on how to incorporate everybody into every scene is really great. In addition, when you get your first level, one thing I like about this a lot too is so this is what the breakdown for your class thing will look like. But what it includes in the list is everything that you will be picking for your character. So you don't need to flip elsewhere in the book to figure out when you get an ancestry feat or when you get a general feat or whatever. It's all listed in the character sheet here. And at each level, you've got interesting things to pick. And again, don't think of feats as the way they were in previous editions of Pathfinder or 3.5 or 3, or even Starfinder for that matter. Every level, you get to pick some neat new way to customize your character, be that your ancestry ability, your skill feat, your class feat. So there's an extraordinary amount of really cool little things you can do to customize your character in a very meaningful way. One of the classes I mentioned as I went through here too, you may have noticed that there was one thing that sounded a little strange and one thing that was missing. And that would, of course, be the champion and the paladin. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, one change they made from the playtest is that the champion is now effectively what the paladin was. The paladin is one kind of champion that you can play. The way they describe the champion in the rulebook is you are an emissary of a deity, a devoted servant who has taken up a weighty mantle, and you adhere to a code that holds you apart from those around you. While champions exist for every alignment, as a champion of good, you provide certainty and hope to the innocent. You have powerful defenses that you share freely with your allies and innocent bystanders, as well as holy power you use to end the threat of evil. Your devotion even attracts the attention of holy spirits who aid you on your journey. So what this does, basically, you're still playing a good character, but it allows you to do what a lot of people house ruled, which was play something other than lawful good. So they've got chaotic good, neutral good, a lawful good, different versions of the champion, which are the paladin is the lawful good one, the redeemer is the neutral good one, and the liberator is the chaotic good one. Each of those decisions, just like every other sub decision in all your other classes, will often give you access to a specific type of ability, be that a feat or some kind of innate power. One of the things that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has done as well with the different classes, a lot of things that used to be class abilities, they all now run off of something called focus. And what focus is basically a pool of power that your character can draw on to fuel their special abilities. And those are things like, you know, your circle ability you get from being a druid, your lay on hands ability, or whatever your other ability is as a paladin, like retributive strike or whatever, your specialty spell or power as a wizard, the sorcery, the bloodline power that you get from whatever you picked as your sorcerer, you get access to those things. And it's at a max, the focus pool has a maximum of 3 as you go along, but there is a exploration action you can take to refocus your focus. So there's a neat way of, you can use this stuff, and it does limit the amount of uses you get for it, but you can also recover that in, you know, by taking effectively like what would be a short rest in D&D, in D&D 4th or D&D 5th. Let's see here. So that's what the way. Otherwise, the champion plays very much like the paladin. It's a heavy armored kind of, you know, person who fights for the good, you know, and channels some divine power. One thing they do not get is spells. At least I don't believe they do. You can take those archetype multi-class feats that I mentioned, or that would allow you to gain like access to clerical spells or, you know, druid spells or whatever. But at default, you do not gain access to that. What you do, though, potentially gain access to is special powers from your deity as well, too. Clerics and paladin or champions are the two classes that also gain powers from their and skills from their deities. So that's pretty cool. I mean, like, I think that's a pretty standard thing in most modern versions of D&D, at least like things that are from 3rd forward. But it's a really cool way to also customize the character before you ever dip into the differences that come from your feats. What else here? Spells. Let's talk about spells too. So I mentioned that there are, you know, druid spells. That's actually not accurate. Spells are divided into 4 different types, and this is the same as they were in the playtest. There's arcane spells, there are divine spells, there are primal spells, and there are occult spells. And depending on the class or the class feature that you've got, you may gain access to one of those. Some of those make sense. I mean, like obviously the wizard is casting arcane spells. The cleric is casting divine spells. The druid is casting primal spells. Interestingly, the bard is no longer an arcane caster. They cast occult spells. And then depending on your bloodline as a sorcerer, you might draw on different things. So for instance, like the aberrant one draws on occult, whereas the demon or angelic bloodlines, they draw on the divine spell list. Fey touched, you know, bloodline, it draws on the primal. And each of the spell lists, there are some overlaps like there were in Pathfinder 1, but there's a lot of differences as well, too. So it really makes each type of caster feel very, very different. You know, and the occult thing is something new in Pathfinder 2nd. The Occult Adventures was introduced as part of the Pathfinder 1 life cycle, and they tried to sort of make it fit as kind of what psychics were, but feel more mysticky, ancient, unknowable knowledge kind of stuff. And that's the approach they've taken with occult, because there's a different skill. Occultism is different from Arcana. So they teach different things, and I kind of dig that. Like the idea that there's a difference between modern, you know, codified spellcasting magic and that ancient, unknowable stuff you'll find in a hidden crypt somewhere. You know, it fits that the bard is the one who kind of casts from that. Monks in this is probably one of the class I have seen played the most from the playtest up until now, and monks are exceptionally badass in this. They got a big bucket of hit points, lots of skills, and lots of neat abilities that take advantage of the action economy. And I'm going to get through the classes first before I go back and talk about the action economy, because it's really a clever innovation for this. But one of the things that monks do as well is they have access to these things called stances, and that's often how you will. It'll slightly change the way you're fighting. You'll do maybe a little bit more damage, maybe a little different type of damage. You'll gain different traits on your attacks, and then you'll gain some collateral benefit, like maybe you can move across difficult terrain, or you can leap, before you do your attack, or whatever. Rangers obviously are going to be very recognizable to what they were in previous editions, but they don't gain spells either unless you multi-class. Rogues will look very familiar to previous previous editions. One thing I like that they've added in this as well, which was in Starfinder, is they've given sample builds, in each of the different classes. So it gives you ideas of how to build certain types of things. Now, people who are experts in Pathfinder may find like, I don't need to be suggested with that too. But, if it's a game that's designed to be just a little bit of helpful information for people coming from a different game to get their footing for this game, I think that's helpful. And in particular for brand new players, it's a really clever thing. And usually it's at least 3 options I think they give for each of them. So for instance, the rogue has listed, there is a scoundrel, there is a thief, and I've just made myself a liar. There's only 2 in there. So I know there's 3 from some other ones. So I guess there's between 2 and 3 for each of them, but it's pretty clever. Like it helps you figure out what type of, specific class trait you should take, what type of feats you should take, and what attributes you should favor. I mentioned that the Sorcerer remains unchanged from previous editions in the sense that it has Charisma as its key stat, and then your Bloodline will have a dramatic effect on how your character plays at the table. It's even more so in this edition, particularly with the change to what spell list you're casting from. And honestly, again, that might be something that people have been doing for quite some time, but it feels pretty good that they've baked that in. It really makes the different Sorcerer Bloodlines feel distinctly different from each other, beyond just like a couple different spells and maybe a feat. If you're curious too, the different Bloodlines that are in the core rulebook are Aberrant, Angelic, Demonic, Diabolic, Draconic, Elemental, Fey, Hag, Imperial, and Undead. And if you are jonesing to play an Oracle, say from the previous edition, I think that a number of these Bloodline archetypes will do in a pinch. You're not going to get a lot of the other things that came with the Oracle, where you're going blind or you're some other kind of marking or whatnot. But it'll be fairly close to what what you experienced playing as an Oracle. And then of course there is the Wizard, and that I think brings us to the end of the classes. Different classes can also have animal companions or familiars, and there's some really great rules for customizing those things in here as well too. They're very template oriented, so it's not like you're suffering through a huge list of decisions to make. It's very easy to personalize your familiar and get it to the table pretty quickly, or your animal companion. I mentioned that the archetypes are the ways that you will be multi-classing your characters. So that's what, say, the list for the different archetypes look like. And again, like, if you are used to the normal Pathfinder way of kind of like mixing and matching classes to make your thing, that's just, again, it's best to not think of this as, as the way that this doesn't measure up to that. It's to see if you can do similar things to what you did achieve with your previous edition. Take what the base character is, the idea, the core concept, and stuff like that, and then you'll be able to see if you can find a character that plays at the table similar to that. I think what you might find is that you actually end up making a much more interesting character, but I'm not. Again, that may not be fair for me to say, because I just was not really a big Pathfinder player, and that wasn't the. I wasn't one of those who suffered over the really complex options that you could have. Now, I mentioned that skills were a big. I guess I didn't mention this, but skills have been streamlined as well. So your skill list consists of acrobatics, arcana, athletics, crafting, deception, diplomacy, intimidation, lore, which is a sub-skill that can be a bunch of different things, medicine, nature, occultism, perform, religion, society, stealth, survival, and thievery. And each of those skills has an untrained actions that you can do, and it has trained actions that only someone who is trained can do. One substantial change from PF1 to this one is that all the things that used to be maneuvers, so like grappling, disarming, bull rushes, stuff like that, all of those are untrained actions with athletics now. Now that might seem overpowering, where like, oh, they're going to be so good, but generally, the exercise of those different actions, often the ones that are really devastating, like disarm, what those are is they're played out like attrition. So like, if you make a success, if you get a success and not a crit success on a disarm, it gives you +2 chances to do the next one. And maybe now's a good time to talk about the action economy, because there's certain ways that this will matter, because what the skills do is give you options to do in your action. So unlike previous versions of Pathfinder, D&D, or Starfinder, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has your actions that you have available to you at default are 3 actions and 1 reaction. That's what every character has access to. And those actions can be things like attacking, striding, which is your move, seeking, which is like to really try and just gather some information. So that question of like, can I make a perception check and not take an action? No, you're seeking. And there's a bunch of other subsets to that too. Step is a thing where you're making a careful step that does not trigger reactions. And the reason that's important is because attacks of opportunity are not a thing as a universal constant in this. There are certain classes. The fighter gains access to attack of opportunity. So if you do something that would trigger a reaction, like take an action that has a manipulate trait, and that's like casting spells or like getting something out of a storing for a potion or something like that. Or if you try and move with that isn't just a step, then it triggers a reaction, which might be an attack of opportunity. In addition, not every monster has these. So what the net result is that it is a much more mobile fight than what it was previously. And in addition, you can still, there isn't combat reflexes, so you're not like stacking a bunch of extra reactions to, where you're like, oh shit, this thing, no one's ever going to be able to move around this thing. And I like that a lot. I mean, I think that it makes for allows you to take advantage of mobility a lot more than what you were in previous versions. And even, to be honest, in older things, like in Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, combat can be really static, unless you're doing a careful withdrawal and stuff like that. So I think that's a really interesting decision. But the 3 actions, though, the way that the attacks are mitigated against that is that at default, your second attack in a round gets -5, and your third attack in a round gets -10. There is one easy way to get that down, and that is if you were using an agile attack. And an agile attack is like an unarmed attack or a light weapon or something like that. Those things are -4 on their second attack and then -8 on their third. Now, one of the ways that the class mechanics get, kind of work with that is there's certain abilities that will play with that'll give you some special way of sort of like cheating with those things. So for instance, the fighter can select a feat called Power Attack. What Power Attack is you spend 2 actions to make your attack, and if you're successful, then you get to roll basically double damage on your attack, which is awesome. And if you crit, whoa, big hit, double damage on your double damage. Awesome. But it takes 2 actions, and it counts as 2 attacks as far as multi-attack penalties work. So what that means is if you choose to do your power attack and then follow up with a third, you're going to suffer a -8 or -10 attack on that roll, depending on what kind of weapon or what kind of attack you made. The monk, for instance, also had their Flurry of Blows ability. What that allows them to do is they spend 1 action and get to make their first 2 attacks, but the multi-attack penalty works normally. So your first attack is made at your full attack rate. Second one is probably going to be -4. Unless you've got some ability to use monk weapons, it's going to be -4 because unarmed fists are agile weapons. So that's how they sort of model that. And again, the multi-attack still works. So if you want to be a monk and you do your Flurry of Blows, and then you want to try and do your next attack, and Flurry of Blows has a trait that I can't remember what it's called, but basically it's a thing that limits that to one use per round. So You make your full attack. If you're going to do another attack, then you're going to suffer your -8 or -10 on that. And then you've got one leftover action. And one interesting thing with these actions is that it gives you, it's very easy to figure out what you can do with an action. There's not the, like, trying to call back, like, okay, what can I do with a minor action again? Or what can I do with a swift action again? It's very easy. It's an action. As long as it's something that costs one action, you can do it. Another way that the action economy really excels, I think, is making shields feel very present in this game. If you want to benefit from the AC bonus that you get from your shield, you got to spend an action to raise your shield, to get it ready. In addition, when you have a raised shield, if you are from certain classes, or if you've got the feat called Shield Block, what you can do is, as a reaction, try and interpose that shield in the way. Each shield has a hardness rating, and then that is subtracted from the damage that you take. If the damage is not all absorbed by your shield, the excess goes to both you and your shield has a middle ground point of its health that's called the break point. And if it hits the break point, it breaks and you can no longer use it. You got to cast it aside. But in your exploration phase, you can try and repair it. And the neat effect of that, like, it sounds like it's a lot of stuff to keep track of, but to be honest, it's very easy. If you're tracking your hit points, it's very easy to track your shield's hit points. And as you go up, your shields get more powerful, and there's certain classes that can augment, like the paladin has a neat class ability they can pick that augments the hardness and hit points of their shield. So that's pretty cool. What it does is it makes a sword and board fighter, or like a spear and board fighter, or paladin or whatever, feel really different in play, because they've got that interesting action they're taking each round and a different interpose. And it leads to really interesting decisions over the course of play too, because in one of our sessions, the paladin, who was a sword and board fighter, was making good use of his shield. It got damaged, and then he couldn't use it, so he had to repair it, but he only repaired it so it was 1 hit point above his break rate. So what it made is that every round he'd get it up because he wanted that AC bonus. And but there were certain attacks where he's just like, I can't absorb that hit because it's going to destroy the shield, and I want to keep benefiting from that AC bonus. And the reason that AC bonus is still meaningful is because, again, everything is sort of parity to your level. So it means that, like, a +1 bonus or a +2 bonus does have a bigger effect. It's a much more meaningful bonus than what it is in like when it was a much larger range, like in previous editions of Pathfinder or the other things. Fighting for that extra 2 points to bump your AC up when what you're fighting might have an attack bonus a little lower than you is pretty big, especially against those iterative attacks that they're keeping hammering in on you on the second attack and the third attack. So that's really cool. And also spellcasters, the way that you govern how many actions it takes to cast a spell, it depends on the number of components. So the components that you will have on your different spells will have, like, verbal, somatic, material, or focus, and those are interchangeable. Depending on how many actions you have, or how many components rather you have in your spell, that will tell you how many actions it takes to cast it. And some spells, and the two most obvious ones I can think of are Heal and Magic Missile. They depend, the effect of them depends on how many actions you spend on it. So Magic Missile is very easy to understand. If you spend 1 action on it, you shoot 1 Magic Missile. If you spend 3, so your whole round, 3 actions on it, 3 of them go flying out. And they stack. So, like, the cool thing with that is, if you're firing against one thing, you stack all the damage for the purpose of weaknesses and vulnerabilities or resistances. So it's a cool, it's a cool risk reward decision you make in the moment at the table. And similar to Heal, actually has a different effect. It gets better the longer you spend on it. So if you cast Heal with 1 action, it heals at default at first level. It heals 1 target for 1d8 points of hit point damage. If you spend 2 actions, it heals 1, and the first one is range of touch. If you heal someone at range, 2 actions, it heals at range, doing 1d8 plus 8. And if you spend 3 actions, you burst out and you do a bunch of heals of 1d8 to everyone within 30 feet. And we had that particular spell come up as a really interesting decision too, where this character who's playing or players playing a druid was trying to figure out, like, well, I'm at really low hit points right now and I want to get some heals off, and there's a bunch of undead around this guy, but is it better to just spam 1 big heal on the guy, or to spread out, to spam a big heal and then me get some distance? And that kind of, resource management and action economy decisions in the moment, like at the table, is one of the things that is the most fun about this game. And it's something I feel that it sets it apart from any previous edition, where there's more interesting combinations and decisions that you get to make each round. Do I spend the round getting my shield up, or do I try and go for that last strike, with my third action? And as I said, each of a bunch of the different skills, they are keyed to different actions as well. And the reason I mentioned the multi-attack penalty before talking about skills is because all of those maneuvers that I talked about, the push or the shove, the escape actually is an attack as well, grapple, disarm, all of those are attack actions, which means they attract the multi-attack penalty. So you could have an action where, like, I'm going to try and grapple this guy and try and get it at the highest bonus, and oh shit, I failed. Now I'm going to, like I mentioned before, that my one of my paladin players punched an owlbear in the head. That's because he failed his grapple. He was pretty sure he wouldn't be able to succeed in the grapple again, but thought he might be able to hit the thing, even with the multi-attack penalty, so he slammed him in the head. And the reason he used his fist rather than his sword is because fist was agile, -4 on multi-attack, versus the sword, which was -5. So, again, it's interesting, game mechanic decisions you get to make at the moment. But by opening those maneuvers up to pretty much anybody, and linking it to the athletics, thing, so you got to be trained to have a decent chance of succeeding at it. It means that that type of grappling action and ground and pound, and something more than just like I hit it with my sword or I hit it with my sword. There's lots of more options you can take in this that are reasonably likely to succeed. So it's really, really good that way. There's a lot of things like identifying magic and so forth that are actually classified under the different skills as well, that are trained only. So you can use detect magic to detect things, but it's going to be a skill thing to try and understand and make sense of those things. Another one that's worth mentioning as well, because it comes up in every tactical encounter, is if you are trained in medicine, then you can do something called treat wounds after a combat. And what it does, well, there's two effects. If you're successful, it will restore a certain amount of hit points. So it's binding the wounds, and the amount of hit points that it restores is linked to the level of training. So a trained person can only roll against a certain amount. An expert can make a higher target number and restore more hit points. And the other thing they do is they get rid of a condition called wounded. Pathfinder 2nd takes a great deal of advantage of the versatility of conditions. There's not the massive, encyclopedic list like there was in PF1, or even in Starfinder for that matter. This is an example of what I'll hold up the camera here. This is the conditions in 2nd edition. Hopefully, let me get the glare off of there. Boom. So that'll give you an idea. Oh, come on, camera, work with me. My apologies if this is not. There we go. Come on, camera, focus. There you go. So what each of these do, there's two things. So I just saw it get, what do you call it? Get it foggy again. What it does is it allows you to have some very easy shorthand ways of reflecting mechanical consequences of certain conditions. So, if you're prone, that is a condition. If you are sickened, that is a condition. And they also take advantage of numbers for certain things. So frightened, for instance, will have a number associated with it. So will sickened. That's the penalty that you'll get to certain actions, but it also normally it will go down by 1 each phase. So your frightened 3 will go down to a 2, will go down to a 1, unless you get a successful save or a successful skill. And then this is, again, where crit successes play in, because if you get a crit success, it'll reduce it by 2. And that's a neat way of sort of just streamlining the idea of like duration for different effects. You're not tracking like, okay, how many rounds is this? No, it's a sickened 3. Boom, 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 and it counts down. The other condition I mentioned was wounded. So the way wounded works, it interfaces with the dying rules. So if your character loses all of your hit points, you go down. There's no negative hit points in this. It's sort of like 3rd edition like that. And sort of like 3rd edition, you can go down to dying 3. When you go down, you get the dying 1 condition. And then you'll make a recovery check. The recovery checks have dramatically reduced in difficulty from the playtest. If anyone played the playtest, the difficulties were fucking crazy high in that. So it was really hard to get back up or to stabilize, but they're easier in this. So you get down to dying 1, then if at the end of the round you don't recover, you're dying 2, dying 3. If you hit dying 4, time to roll up a new character. Now, the way that wounded works in it is if you get restored, if you make your recall or someone heals you or whatever, you stop being unconscious. And you can also, if you're dying, if you fall down, you can spend all of your hero points to immediately stabilize at 1 hit point. And that might seem like, these characters are going to be too tough, but it really feels like players are desperate to make use of their hero points at play. So the decision of whether they're going to hold one back in case things go against them, or whether they're going to try and get that successful dice roll, is a really interesting in the moment decision as well too. And it's another example of how the game makes those decisions at the table so important and so, I don't know, so interesting. And there are things that aren't necessarily looking at your character sheet as well too, but I'll talk about that a little more later. The way wounded works is that if you get up, you then gain the wounded 1 thing. And the next time you go down, if you go down again, that stacks. So if you go down, instead of going to dying 1, you're now at dying 2. In addition, if the thing that took you down was a critical hit, you automatically go down to dying 2. And then every time you go down again, if you are recovered, you gain another wounded status. So it's a really clever way of getting around that whack-a-mole feel that people, I've seen people complain about online about 5th edition, where there's no consequence to going down to 0 hit points. Well, there is in this, which is wounding. And that actually gives me an opportunity to talk about like another good example of what a skill feat can be. There's a skill feat called Battle Medic. And what that allows you to do is to use your the treat wounds in combat. So that allows you to try and, like, if it's a really long and complicated fight and someone gets an unlucky first couple of rounds and they go down, you can hopefully bind them up and get them moving again. It does the hit point recovery thing as well, but it also gets rid of that wounded condition. And again, I don't know, I keep harping on how much I like that it makes, it gives you ways to interface with the game as it's playing, but I really, really love that about this game. Other things about the skills is that the skills are, actually, here's an interesting thing. So at the start of a tactical encounter, so an encounter where there's going to be combat, or an encounter where you're going to go on a round for round basis, because social encounters can also function this way if the DM decides they want to run it that way. There's no initiative stat in this. Instead, at default, you will use your perception, and everybody has some kind of training in perception. So perception will always be something that you're at the very least half-ass capable at. But if during the exploration phase, before you transition into combat, you were using another skill, or there's another skill that makes sense, you use that instead. So if you were sneaking around, you'll roll stealth to determine what your initiative is. If you're in the in kind of the wilds, and you say, "Look, I'm keeping an eye out for ambush as I'm going along here," maybe the DM will let you use survival instead. And the game really, really encourages that kind of flexibility. That kind of give you ways to say yes to the players that will not unbalance the game, and I love that. And in social encounters, they suggest, depending on how you're approaching that thing, maybe it's intimidate you're going to roll for your initiative. Maybe it's society, because the comings and goings of the highfalutin members of court or whatever. There's also some interesting skill feats that allow you to use replacements for something things. So, like, for instance, there's a deception skill feat called, I think it's called Beautiful Lie, or something like that. But basically what it is you use deception to lie to someone, to flatter them. And you get to enjoy the benefit of what diplomacy is normally used for, which is to increase the reactions to people. Now, the other thing I like about the contested skill rolls being keyed to levels is that it keeps things interesting, and keeps things cinematic. If you think of it in terms of that, this is also creating a fiction. There's not really something that's interesting about watching players walk around in God mode all the time, particularly in presumably what you're doing is setting up scenarios where things are going to be challenging. And it's the thing that I find interesting about the level-based approach is that, assuming that you're going to keep players in challenging encounters, there will be lots of opportunities for the risk of failure. They're not going to get to the point where the math will dramatically outweigh the way the fiction is playing. But I guess conversely too, like if your characters are playing 15th level characters who have now excelled up to like legendary status or whatever else, in some of their skills, if they're using it against like the common peons or whatnot, they are going to get those crit successes every time. So they're going to get amazing results, and the game will reflect that by virtue of how it's going. But when they're going against people against their equal status, it will give you an appropriate, challenge. So, so anyway, so that's something that's there. The feats are in as well. So I mentioned there's skill feats, and then there are general feats. So depending on your level, you'll get access to certain skill feats. This is kind of a nesting doll situation where skill feats can only be picked as skill feats. There are general skill feats, and then there are skill feats that are key to different skills. And then there are general feats. Skill feats are general feats. So when you get a general feat, you can choose to pick a skill feat as well, which I think is a change from the playtest. But when you get a skill feat, you cannot select a general feat. So there. Hopefully that made sense. I don't think it's terribly complicated, but I may have just said it in a really bad way. As with the other, options, there's a lot of options for your different feats too. So, that's, oh boy, there's your list of just general feats there. There's some of the general skill feats. And then this is the listing of the skill feats in the game so far. So you do have lots of options. And then there are certain, just like in Pathfinder 1 or 3.5, there are certain skill feats that will only, you'll only gain access to them at higher levels. So that way you can get some really badass stuff that you can do as the legendary heroes that you should be. Equipment is very similar to the previous edition. One of the things that's interesting about armor is that each set of armor has what's called, it's a strength score. And if you have a strength score equal to that amount, you don't suffer the movement penalty anymore. And that's awesome. So no more of your paladin, in heavy plate, slowly making their way up towards combat. They're able to move at a decent rate, and the AC bonuses, because it is a matter of parity, the AC bonuses are not quite as big of a range as you saw in previous editions, but they definitely are there. And Armour Specialization does a really interesting thing where it unlocks certain kind of like special abilities with armor. So you will get damage reduction with some of the heavier armor, which is pretty cool. That's a standard feature in Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, and I really like that a lot. And actually, D&D 5th has that one feat, heavy armor feat or whatever, that gives you a DR rating too. I mentioned how shields feel more present in this game than they do in other ones, and you got your buckler, your wooden shield, your steel shield, your tower shield, and then there are rules in the core rulebook for different materials that it can be made from, and that affects the hardness and whatever. Just like other weapons, armor can get damaged as well, as can weapons. And then if you are trained in craft, or whether you're not, I think, you can make a roll to try and repair your stuff. And the amount that you get to repair is based on your level of proficiency. If you are untrained crafter, you're gonna be able to bang stuff together maybe, but it's kind of the like, it's the dad who knows nothing about building fences. Whereas like if you are a legendary, like you might be able to restore that shield brand new, even though it was, smashed to flinders by a dragon of some kind. The list of weapons is pretty lengthy too. This game as well distinguishes a lot of stuff like magic items, formulae, and equipment as common or uncommon. And the real difference there is just that common is stuff you can start with. Uncommon is you need DM permission, or it might be trickier to track down. It also differentiates the formulae that you would get for crafting stuff. So there is a thing in it. There's a book of recipes, effectively, you can pick up that has every common recipe of every piece of equipment in the guide, and that in fiction, it's kind of like, so I pick up this book and suddenly I can make everything from like an arrow to like a cooking pot, but whatever. I mean, like, it's a game of heroic heroes. It's not a game of like learning what kind of crafter you are, and you do need to pick up formulae for more uncommon things. So it's not like that's not a potential reward you can offer your players. As I mentioned, the different crit effects from the different weapons are different depending on the weapon as well, but that's only certain classes that gain access to those weapon specialization crits. The traits themselves are really cool. So one good example of how it makes different things or different weapons feel different is, so a great sword has an ability or a trait called versatile. And what that does is it allows you to do, well, it's versatile penetrating. So, or penetrating, is that what it's called? Anyway, whatever P is, penetrating, poking, I don't know. the piercing is what it is. So it normally does slashing damage, but what versatile means is you can do piercing damage with it instead if that is more advantageous. What a great axe does in comparison is it has the sweep trait. And what sweep does is it's easier to hit multiple enemies. So if you're doing a multi-attack, you get +1 to hit your next enemy. And there's a whole list. These are all the different weapon traits that are available. And they're very, very minor. So, it's not going to be something that is going to be so complicated that it'll be difficult to keep track of. The Conan 2D20 game does that to make their weapons feel very different. And it is a bit of a bookkeeping nightmare with that. This is much simpler. It's the kind of thing that would take up a tiny box on your character sheet. So that's pretty cool. But it does, make each of them feel different. It does offer, as I give you, class kits. So, if you want your pick up and go, you've got those preset things in there. And then there's the standard selection of items you would expect from a core rulebook. I'm not going to go through all of those. I mentioned the difference in spells in this, about how they use take advantage of the action economy to play through the different things you can do. Or to model how long it takes you to get through the different spells. There are 10 levels in spells, not 9. And it feels like they've spread out. I haven't sat down and done a comparison, but it feels like some of the mid-range spells, they may have bumped a little higher. So you're going to get access to those game-changing spells a little later. I'm not 100% sure on that because I haven't sat down and done a full-on comparison, but there's an extraordinary amount of spells. I did see some people were complaining during the playtest that there's not enough spells in here. And compared to Pathfinder, the 10 years of books that are out, there's not as much. But there's more spells for each of the different types of spells in this, or there was in the playtest at least, than there is in the Player's Handbook for 5th edition. So there is a huge amount of spells available. These are what the spells look like. They've got the list there, and then just like they did in previous editions, a little kind of quick reference of what school it comes from and what it does. So if you're just trying to pick what your spell is, you can flip through. Cantrips in this, one change they made from the playtest. So cantrips, well, let me back up. So there is a mechanic called heightening. And what heightening is just what if you're familiar with what those feats did in previous editions and the way you can cast higher level spells in 5th, then you know what I'm talking about. You can cast certain spells at higher level and they get better and better effects. Heal is a great example of that. Heal is your all-around healing spell. It just does boom, boom, boom. It has those 3 different effects, but then it basically gets doubled or an extra D8 at each level of spell that you cast it at. And other spells similarly, scale that way. In addition, your cantrips automatically heighten as well. And it seems like for the damaging cantrips, at least, they do about as much damage as a sling or what a dagger would do. And that, I really, really like that. I felt like the cantrips in the playtest were a little underpowered. And the cantrips by comparison in Starfinder, they're kind of crap. Once you get past a certain level, I don't know why you would ever use your combat cantrips because they're garbage, particularly compared to your weapons. In this, you get to feel magical, but it doesn't, when you're fighting in melee or in a combat encounter, but you still get to actually, it's not overpowering. I do feel that the 5th edition cantrips are overpowered. They do too much damage in comparison to what martial characters can do. So that's a matter of taste, the insane amount of people playing for 5th edition may know better, but for me, for my taste, this feels like a right balance. It's a good mix in between. Now you may be asking, but Kev, if they're able to do increased damage each level, then how the hell does that compare to a flat amount of damage from a weapon? Well, I'm glad you asked. One of the things that this differs in as well, and they made this change. If you're familiar with the Pathfinder playtest, you may know where I'm going with this. But in the playtest, what they had is basically each plus to your weapon would not only give you a +1 to hit, it also added an extra dice to the damage you did with it. So if your dagger does 1d4, a +1 dagger would be +1 to hit and do 2d4 damage. A +2 dagger similarly would scale up. In this, what they've done now is they've separated out. In the playtest, they had those flat kind of modifiers be something that could be taken off as a rune. It was separate from whatever other neat ability your thing might have. It was a rune you could put on your weapon, similar to fusions in Starfinder, if you're familiar with that. And they've changed that in this edition, or in the final product. Now the bonus to hit is separate from the amount of damage you get from a potency, I think, or a striking rune. Striking rune is the thing that adds extra damage. So it allows you to introduce magical items earlier on in the game without suddenly having your like second or third level characters doing double weapon damage on every hit, which then gets doubled again on a crit. So I feel that's a better fit. That's a better balance for slowly introducing things. And the control modifier is you cannot have a striking rune higher bonus than what the actual magical bonus is. So if you have a +2 dagger, you could have a striking rune that would give up to +2 extra dice for your damage. That is the way that is balanced, you know. So it's presumed that your characters are going to be gaining magical striking, like the martial characters are going to gain striking bonuses, and then the spellcasters get to still stay competitive, but not have to only rely on their spells. They can use cantrips and not feel overpowered, but still feel like they got something interesting to do. I really love how the cantrips came out in this. It's a really, really cool balance. And for me, it hits the sweet spot between always letting your magical characters feel magical, you know, in all the encounters, not reducing them to being like, well, I guess I'm picking up my crossbow, or I guess I'm picking up my whatever, you know, without making them overpowered. What else can I say about the spells? There's far too much complexity in all the individual spells to really go into to all of them. But one of the things that they do is the spells feel a lot more flexible, you know, like because you can heighten a lot of them. It's not just like your save DC is higher. It really changes some spells, and like so some spells get brand new things that they can do if you cast them as a higher level spell. So certain spells that used to be like duplicates effectively, like they would be the same thing at different levels. Now it's just one spell that gains new things that they can do at higher levels, and that's cool. It also allows, you know, it again gives the players more interesting options to do in play, you know, when they're preparing their spells or casting their spells. This version as well, it bakes in the Golarion setting as a default setting. So in a similar way to how the most recent edition of RuneQuest chose Glorantha as the default setting, they've leaned in that direction. Now, it's not everyone will like that. Because not everyone likes to play in Golarion, and maybe some, you know, a lot of people prefer to, you know, Pathfinder being a generic kind of game you can apply to anywhere. Well, the thing is that Golarion is kind of the catch-all generic setting anyway. So if you choose to ignore the, let's see here, the 30 pages or 23 pages that are devoted to the setting material in this, you're fine. You know, like it's a very, very small part of a 240-page book. It gives you domains and gods that are from Golarion, but it's ridiculously easy to reskin them. They are so generic. It's easy to pick out like, oh, there's the magic god, there's the earth god, there's whatever. For me, I run this right now in Greg Gillespie's Barrow Maze setting. And the Barrow Maze setting is an OSR setting that has very bog standard, generic, old school, you know, gods. There's a god of magic, a god of war. It's super easy to pick what, you know, what skills they gain access to, what domain powers and so forth. And that's all in here. I kind of wish the domain stuff was a little further forward, but I understand why it was in the section with the setting stuff. The section for playing the game. So these are the rules of the game. These are all the things for tactical combat, for downtime, for encounter. This takes up a grand total of 37 pages. And I'll just let that sink in for a minute, because for those familiar with Pathfinder, it's an extraordinarily complex game. Previous editions have huge sections on rules. So as we dive into what the, you know, nitty gritty is in this, that's your playing the game section. One of the things that I say to my friends who are more familiar with Pathfinder First Edition that I find astounding is that the DM screen for Pathfinder Second Edition, which is right here, wow, it does not have a list of combat modifiers. I don't think I can recall an edition of D&D that doesn't have a list of combat modifiers. Now the 5th edition one, maybe that does, because I just don't run it enough. But it blows my mind. Like the reason you don't need that is because the conditions will often dictate what's going on in terms of how they're affecting your character. And then there's really only a couple of other things. Are you flat-footed, which is a condition? If you're flat-footed, you get -2 to your AC. Are you being flanked? Well, that makes you flat-footed, so that's number one. Do you have cover? Well, then there is going to be a bonus that will apply depending on how much cover you have, and depending on whether you took one of your actions to take cover. Because if you take cover, it increases the bonus you get from cover, which is so cool. So it gives a feel of, you hopping up from cover, firing your bow, and ducking behind cover again. Are you benefiting from concealment, which is now something that's called a flat roll? So no more digging out your percentile dice to figure out if there's a miss. You roll a d20 like you do for everything else, and there's a certain number that you'll roll against that will be dictating whether something happens or not. Whether they miss you because of concealment or not. Those are really the only modifiers. Like there are situational modifiers that you might be able to pick up, but it's up to the DM to kind of dictate what those things are. So here's another mind-blowing thing. There's no penalty for firing into melee. So the whole thing of like mobility and blah, 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 all that stuff is gone. It's just, fire in, fire out, whatever. What it means for play. Now, there is something that sort of does that, because your allies will give cover as well, too. So the cover does sort of do the heavy lifting for what used to be some of those modifiers, but that is one way where this dramatically differs from the previous editions as well. Another thing that I found particularly mind-blowing is the limited amount of modifiers. And I'm trying to find the list of it too, because I always forget one of them. There are only 4 types of modifiers in this game. So the whole thing about like stacking, if it's the same type and there's one of the 4 is untyped. Untyped stuff stacks. So we have circumstance modifiers, we have item modifiers, and we have one more modifier that I always forget, and I probably should have looked up before I started the stream, but there's one other one that is effectively like something you're getting from a spell or whatever, like something that is an inherent kind of bonus that isn't an item bonus. Those are the only kinds of like types of bonuses. So there's no more like fishing around for the right type of bonus or whatever else. Like there's just these very flat types of bonuses. So that I think that also does a great job of streamlining play and simplifying the play at the table. I think I mentioned it before, but it's worth repeating that the hero point thing is it's intended to be something that you keep giving people throughout the game. Every hour of play should see those players get more hero points, because the game is designed for those players to be taking advantage of the hero points. Either to avoid dying or to try and get the, when the dice just are not on their side, to try and get that, get them to work for them. I really like that. I don't feel like breaks the game in any way. Adversaries are not so fragile in this, or if they are fragile, they're intended to be that way because they're minions or they're way low level. So I don't feel like it really breaks the, the flow of the game. If anything, it just allows the players to feel more like badasses. And it is another thing, like I said, that makes the players make interesting decisions in terms of the resource management while they're playing the game, which is really exciting. Seeing the look on their face as they're figuring out, like, do I try and re-roll this attack roll and take this guy down, or do I save it in case he hits me and knocks me down? That's really, really cool stuff. After what it does, the playing the game thing does is it sets out what all the actions are. And one thing you will notice in the game as well is there's all these little, so you'll see these things here. That is the symbol. Come on, camera, work with me. And again, my apologies for folks who prefer a sort of camera down thing here, but that's just not how I do things around these parts. Okay, there you go. So you see here, that is a 2-action action. And this is a 1-action action, because I can tell from how many little squares there are. And actually holding up the ready thing gives me another opportunity to talk about another neat way that there's a risk reward kind of mechanic that's played into your action economy. So the ready actions in this, you spend 2 actions to prepare a 1-action action. So if you want to try and ready, say, an attack, or a free action, that it's the classic if X then Y action. Well, you're spending more now for the benefit of using it as an interrupt rather than on your turn. And it makes for, again, interesting decisions for what am I going to do on my turn. And I should say too, my experience so far with the game has been both during the playtest and since the PF2 has come out, is that it doesn't slow things down. Players aren't fussing around on their turn trying to figure out what to do, because they know what their 3 actions are and they know what their characters are capable of doing. They know sort of what they want to do. So the playing through the rounds is as fast in this as any of the old school games I run. And if you're a regular viewer of my channel, I run a lot of old school games on this, particularly, Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. I'm a big fan of my old school games. That's a big selling point for me for this game as well, is speed of play at the table. I don't want to have to invest 4 hours into one substantial combat, or 2 hours even. I want the things to play through fast and exciting, and I want the tactical complexity there as well. This seems to offer both, and it does it in a really intuitive way. The next section is the game mastery section, which gives you advice on everything from like setting difficulty classes to building hazards and hazards are kind of your catch-all, like, traps or, quicksand or whatever, collapsing ceilings. Advice on, XP. XP is another thing worth talking about. So XP, gone are the days of the XP chart. Now you have 1,000 points. 1,000 XP is the standard. Gain 1,000 XP, you gain a level. The reason that isn't like a ridiculously low amount is because your XP rewards are also keyed to your level. So something that is, for instance, if you face an adversary that is 4 levels above your level and you defeat them, every player gets 160. There's no more like pooling it and then dividing it up. It goes straight to the players. If your party defeats something that is your party level plus 4, it's 160 XP. In converse, something that is minus 4, so 4 below your level, that is only worth 10 XP apiece. In addition, you have set rewards for minor, moderate, and major accomplishments. And the core rulebook suggests that's a way to sort of like reward role-playing, is 10 to 30 XP for good accomplishments in those sort of non-combat scenes. And in addition, it really encourages you to hand out hero points as well for those types of scenes. If you want to speed that up or slow it down, you can dump that to 800 for a fast advancement or bump it up to 1,200. But I mean, 1,000 does seem, if you're following the rules as written, it does seem like that'll take an appropriate amount of time. One interesting consequence, and I may not be right about this because I have not played characters through from 1 to 20 in previous Pathfinder, but it's certainly, compared to old school games, it feels like you're going to have more of an even spread through the levels, which means that you're going to have an opportunity to see your characters go through those levels a little faster than you would in a lot of other kinds of D&D. There's suggestions for party level. One thing I wish I had seen in the core rulebook is suggestions for rewards, like how to break down the specific amounts. I get why they didn't do that, because to be honest, like, as soon as you start playing, you kind of break those rules anyway. And if you're running an adventure path, it's going to give you what the rewards are anyway. So you'll probably start ignoring that anyway. But I do kind of wish that. And as in previous editions, they give you, boom, a list is, if you're playing characters that are higher level than level 1, it tells you what to start with with your gear. You can either get a lump sum and then buy your stuff with that, or you can take money and a specific set of magic items. It's like, for instance, if you're starting at 5th level, you can go with 270 GP, or you can go with 50 GP and then 1 4th level item, 2 3rd level items, 1 2nd level item, and 2 1st level items. It gives you rules for environment, and I really like their environment rules, because one complaint I had about Pathfinder 1 was that survival really stopped being a thing once you were past a certain level. The first couple of levels, you suddenly stopped really caring about it because the DCs for survival were so easy to hit. And now that's just my personal flavor of play. I like I said, I love the AD&D Wilderness Survival Guide, so I like travel having a feel to it. The One Ring RPG does a really good job of making, or Adventures in Middle Earth, if you like 5th edition, that makes travel feel like a thing. There's a game there that you're interfacing with as well. This does that It makes it something that is a more meaningful thing as you're going through the, regardless of whatever your levels are. Obviously, if you're like 10th level or higher, it's not really, your game is not going to be about like, boy, can I make it to Bree, or boy, can I make it to, wherever, to Waterdeep. It's going to be about something different. But I mean, for a longer time, survival and going through the wilderness itself feels like a thing and feels like a presence. I'll also say that the rules for quicksand in this are some of my favorite. I absolutely love how quicksand works in this. It's amazing. I've had nearly 2 groups killed by quicksand so far. And it does a really fun way of taking advantage of the action economy, taking advantage of skills, and it's just terrific, especially if you combine it with monsters. The next section is on crafting, and all of this, like all the massive list of magic items that you would expect from first edition Pathfinder, you can find in here. And the way they organize it is first by level, where it's every type of item in here. And then it goes into the different classifications. So you have your alchemical items, which is a huge list, which alchemists or people trained in craft alchemy. It's again a skill feat. You can learn, craft that stuff. Then it goes into different kinds of magic armor, different kinds of consumables like, stone bullets, storm arrows, that kind of stuff. And it scales up through most of the levels as well, too. So you keep getting new, cool stuff. And in a game like Pathfinder that does feel like, to a degree, it's loot-driven, that's really cool. I think it's neat that, just like in previous editions, like Pathfinder, the Ultimate Equipment Guide had tons of amazing stuff in that. I like that there's lots of cool stuff you can get as you go through levels. It's something I really like about Starfinder, and definitely I like about this as well. The way that some of your magic items like staves and wands and whatnot work is a little different, because you basically invest them with power as you go. So it's not just like a flat set of charges and then like once you're done, it's gone. There is a different mechanic of interfacing with it, which is kind of cool. And there's also a lot more lower level equivalents of things in this. So for instance, if you really want to see your druid or wizard or whatever cruising around with a staff, in other versions of D&D or Pathfinder, you do have to wait till quite a high level to be able to gain access to something like that. Not so in this. There are lower powered versions of the staves, as low as 6th level, where you can start getting them in their hands. They're not as good as the higher level ones, but at least it's something. So, and I like that, because I mean, getting some of those classic signature items in the hands of the players, even though they're like demi versions of it, is great. It really supports a cool kind of like, it lets your character feel cool, like feel like a badass, not like you're, wielding a chump version of something until you hit a certain level. But it also, because those higher level versions are better, you still get the benefit of like, wow, now I got some, big cool thing. The only sort of legacy from Resonance in this that I can see is that you have a maximum of 10 magic items you can have on you. Now, I haven't played at a high level, but the book tells me that's not going to be a concern and not going to be like a thing where you're making resource decisions until very high level. So there is still a limit, so you're not having people wielding a gazillion magic items once they've accumulated a horde of them. But it's not something that's really going to matter in most games. We then go on to a vast array of other. To be honest, it's most of the magic items that you would expect to find in this. Like, one of the things that I found very easy is in my Barrow Maze game, which is based off of a D&D clone called Labyrinth Lord. There's a lot of classic items that are referred to in that I can find Pathfinder equivalents of, which is amazing. So, it's still, even though this is a very, very modern game with very different sensibilities, at its core, those things that you would recognize as classic high fantasy role-playing, it's all there. As I said, and there's an enormous amount of options in there. The book closes out with a list of conditions, which gives you clear definitions. And again, like there's not a massive amount of them, but there's enough that it's easy to model different things. Oh, one other interesting thing too is persistent damage. So persistent damage, it feels very much like a 4th edition thing too, where like bleed or like fire effects or acid, they have a persistent. And what it does is it started around, it affects that player. So the person who's subject to the persistent effect will take the effect. Then they will be able to make a flat save and a flat or a flat roll to try and get it to go away. The flat roll is 15, which means it's only got a 25% chance of going away. So that's not great, but you can spend actions to try and make it, to improve that down to 50-50. So, and the book really kind of leaves it in the hands of the DM and the inventiveness of the player of how you're going to do that. So are they going to dive into a stream? Well, maybe that just goes out automatically if it's fire. Are they going to stop, drop, and roll? Well, maybe that's, you know, that's going to be the, what do you call it? The 10% or the DC 10 rather, or flat roll of 10. They also, in the advice section for the DM or for the game mastery section, I keep saying DM because I'm old and I'm always going to call it that. But when I say DM, I take it you mean, you understand, I mean GM. But it suggests the DM to, if they need to come up with what an action, like how long it takes at the table, they just say, look, it's 1 or 2. It's 1 if you want them to be able to do it 3 times around, or it's 2. That's it. So, you know, stop, drop, and roll, it's probably 2. If standing from prone or dropping prone is 1, I think there's more action involved in that. So I'd probably say 2. Maybe you'd roll differently, you know, or maybe you'd roll differently in the circumstance. Maybe they're going to throw off the top layer of their clothes to try and improve the acid, you know, thing. And, I may be making a big, a lot of hay about this, persistent damage thing. But the thing I really like about that is it's another way that the game encourages the players to interface with the fiction and get mechanical benefits from it. It's that way where the game achieves ludonarrative harmony by letting the game mechanics support what the story is telling them, and I love that. And then what it ends with is a character sheet. Now, the character sheet has seen a lot of criticism at the time of recording. There are so many amateur graphic designers on Twitter who are just picking this to be the thing to shit on about this game, and I just don't get it. Like, it's really busy. But this is Pathfinder. Like, this is not a game that has 4 stats and that's it. Like, yeah, it's what I can tell you is it is very busy. But if you sit down and look at it, everything makes sense. So if you are a brand new player to this, yeah, at first this is, and you're first coming to role-playing games, you're trying to explain to them how they play. Yeah, it's a really busy looking sheet. But I don't think it's all that much busier than what the D&D 5th one is. And I think that when you sit down and read what's on it, it makes sense what it is. So yes, it will take some time to sit down and explain what the things are to someone who's fresh to it. But it's the idea that, oh my God, it's got so much stuff on it, so therefore it's shit and you'll never be able to find things. I just don't buy that. I think it's making a mountain out of a molehill, and I don't buy it. Last thing is there is the glossary and index are combined. So everything that you have in here is there's not only a clear page reference for your glossary, but for where you find it in the game, but it also gives you a little blurb about what it is, and I love that. Because it's a brand new game, we in our sessions we've obviously been looking up a lot of stuff as we play, and it's great. It's a really, really helpful. Nice little feature that's been added in here as well too. Very quickly, I'm not going to go through the full bestiary. I just want to give you a sense of what what's in here. The bestiary itself is, I think it's 340 pages long, 360. So 360 pages. It says over 300 monsters in here. A number of the monsters also have templates. So if you want to make your own vampire, you want to make your own ghoul, you want to make your own ghost, whatever. Or you want to make an advanced or a weak creature. Advanced or weak is just bumping it up and down by 1 level. Those options are in here, but there's, all of your bog standard, D&D style monsters are in here. In addition, there are a number of classic Pathfinder monsters that are in here as well. So it's really interesting that it tries to satisfy those players who have come to love the things that have become really signature Pathfinder monsters like Tatzelworms and Psychopomps and I'm trying to think what else. The expansion of the Aboleth in one of the more recent the Ruins of Aslan thing. They've incorporated that in here too. There's lots of sidebars. So there's a full description of the different the monsters there. There's sidebar information, sometimes which is lore stuff, sometimes which is stat, like mechanic stuff. And then there's your character sheet. Now, the way for designing monsters is not in here. those who are familiar with the Alien Archive may have been, for Starfinder, may have been hoping that there'd be monster building rules in here. There's not. That's going to come in the Game Mastery Guide, which doesn't come out until January. So I really wish it was in here because I want to start building monsters, but whatever. What I imagine is it's going to be a little more complex than what the Game Mastery Guide or what it is in the Alien Archive. And there's certainly enough monsters in here to use or reskin, so that's fine. Regular Pathfinder players, though, who may have been concerned that it will do what Starfinder does, which is to abstract NPCs, that's not the case. You still build NPCs just like player characters. Now, I'm kind of speculating here, but based on the stats in the adventures that are out so far, where they've got sample characters in it, that's what I base that on. And what it seems is there's a standard array of bonuses, just like in Pathfinder Starfinder. Instead of having stats, you instead just have the stat bonuses for the different the different attributes for each monster. So each monster, you do have the stats just like you do in Pathfinder and 3.5, 3, and whatnot. It's just that you only have the modifiers because that's all that's important, really. The way that it seems to work is you're going to spread plus 9 in total amongst the different stats, and no higher than plus 4 in any one. So if you're at, one thing that was a little frustrating, it may be in the core rulebook that it expressly tells you, or in the bestiary expressly tells you how to build NPCs, but I couldn't find it. I might be wrong about that, and if I am wrong, then I apologize. But what I realized, knowing that they call the monsters by level, not challenge rating now, and also looking at what the NPCs are in the monster guide, you just build your NPCs using the core rulebook. So that's that. What that means is that unlike Starfinder, where you really only track the top 2 levels of spells for things, you do have a full slate of spells listed for the NPCs and monsters that can cast spells. And I see where Starfinder and where D&D 5th or 4th, I should say, come from that, where they say, look, like you're never in a combat encounter, you're never going to get through all those anyway, so why have them in there? But I don't like how hard it was to build spellcasters in PF1, but what I liked about having all those spells is it also helped me understand what what their actions in the world are like. When I know that a thing has access to detect magic or to invisibility all the time or to shape ice, say. I've been brainstorming for one of my games, and the smallest version of the White Dragon, it has access to shape ice. And that just made me think, oh, cool. Then that would be something that, it's never going to come up in a combat encounter, or unlikely to, but I can think of creepy ways I could use that ability as part of role-playing stuff for the social scene. So I like that a lot. Because so many of the spells or skills operate off of stats, you've got all the stuff you need for, if you don't want to run just a strict, what is it called? Shoot, loot, scoot campaign, where you're just beating the shit out of all your monsters. The interface for the displays, I should say, for the monsters are very, very easy to read. I've been running my monsters with reading them as I play through the encounter, and it's super easy. Now I'm only playing at low level right now, so I imagine there's more shit to track as you get higher level. But the cool thing is that it does something that 4th edition did that I really liked, which is certain types of adversaries will have similar abilities. And what that means is that fighting them mechanically will feel similar. Like in 4th edition, fighting goblins felt very different mechanically than fighting, say, gnolls or fighting orcs. And it seems like that's something similar here. I will give the example of my favorite and first 2nd edition Pathfinder monster, which is their awesome owl bear. Look at that thing. Ooh, he's so big he can't fit in the frame. The owl bear is a level 4 thing that I threw against 2 of my 3rd level players, and he has 2 different abilities that were really interesting. He's got a blood-curdling screech, which causes them to make potentially gain the frightened condition, and if they critically fail their save, which one of my players did, they run for the hills for a certain length of time. So that's really cool. But the thing I really loved was they've got an ability called Gnaw. And they hit one hit with another, and they get their little beak in there and start gnawing at your guts. And you make a will save, or you become sickened. as you're nauseated by this thing starts trying to get through to your insides. And I just love that. I think that is so evocative, and it feels like, oh God. And to get rid of the sicken condition, you have to spend an action retching to try and make a fortitude save to get it to go away. So I love that. I love how it felt at the table, and the players said it felt very distinct. Like fighting the different types of monsters felt very, very different. Just like in Pathfinder 1, there are certain things that they don't duplicate everything on every page. So like, there are keywords they use like grab or whatnot that you will look up in the back, but the list of keyword abilities or the keyword abilities are a lot less in this than they were in the first one. So it's a lot less of like, what the hell does that do again? Kind of situation. It's much easier to just pick up and play and try and figure out what interesting things you want to do with the monster and their various abilities. And as I said, it plays very, very quickly. Low-level play in this felt just as fast as what my Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea games do. And it had the added benefit of having a really, really interesting action economy that made every decision for monsters and for players fun. Like it had the level of fun that you get from playing a really high complex, tactical game without the numbers burden that comes sometimes with those types of games, and without affecting the pace of play. Combat felt exciting and thrilling. And I mentioned earlier in this video as well about the way that the math works so that higher level monsters feel like a boss fight without having to create some different mechanic to make them bosses or elites or nemesis or whatever equivalent you want to think of. And you never had to make minion rules because just the math will support that feel at the table. So that's the game in a nutshell. Who is this for is the next thing. So the reason I wanted to shoot this video was for people like me who may have been playing in a very, very different style of game, but do have, like, I play, for those, who may not be familiar with the channel, I play a wide variety of different kinds of games. I love some story games. I love some, heavy crunch games. Battletech is a big favorite of mine. I love some of the story games as well, too, like Blades in the Dark and, what the hell is it called? Band of Blades, in particular. Those Forge in the Dark games are pretty cool. The thing I really love about this is it hits a great, great middle ground for a lot of that stuff. It gives me, it is not the game I would use to run everything, but for high action source, like kind of fantasy stuff, I cannot think of a game that I would enjoy running more. I also love that the exploration phase and the downtime phase give me great options for making mini games, the same way that like story games or like the One Ring, where they gamify those sort of areas. It gives a lot of opportunity to, if you don't want to have those things be heavily gamified, you don't necessarily have to, but you can. And there's lots of interesting options and decisions that the players get to make in those things that have mechanical heft to them. Now, I don't mean to make it sound like, there's just like social combat, like if those who are familiar with Ultimate Intrigue, that's one of the subsystems or one of the optional systems that is in there that kind of makes, it just kind of uses combat rules, but calls them all different things and you use different skills. It's not that, but I'm interested in the possibilities of what you can do with that and the amount of creativity you can express as the game master or the DM for those different scenes. And even seeing some of the new stuff, like I noticed in the player's guide for the what do you call it, Age of Ashes adventure path, they've introduced already a new downtime action, and that is effectively make a friend. So you spend a downtime action to try and like pal it up with someone in town, some NPC in town. And if you are, depending on how the result is, you may piss them off. They may like you. They may really like you, and that will have an effect on prices of things, in addition to whatever other thing the DM wants to do. And the reason I think that, like, setting aside that it gives some interesting mechanical benefits, it gives you a way to cheapen stuff. What that does is one of my favorite things, which is it forces the players to interface with the world. It pushes the game into what's happening in the campaign. The only way they learn about who these NPCs are and what they have available to them is by role playing, by doing social encounters, and then it gives them a way to use the stuff that's on the character sheet, to, you know, trying to dictate what they want to do. And just like the other kinds of skill checks I mentioned, it's really flexible. Like the downtime thing expressly says, like, yeah, you might use diplomacy for this, but if it's a smith, maybe you're going to show off how good you are at crafting. Or if it's a sage, maybe you're going to show off your knowledge of ancient cultures with society, or your, you know, arcane studies with arcana, or maybe your knowledge of secret things with occultism, or whatever the hell the player can convince you is an appropriate skill. You know, I mean, it's really it really puts the it opens, I guess, the door up where rather than like, okay, this is what I want to do, let's look at the sheet and see what I need to do it. It's what can I do? You know, what kind of way can I try and, you know, squirrel this? If you're familiar with debating, what kind of way can I try and twist this to take advantage of what I want to actually do? And as I said too, like one of the things that's interesting with every one of the classes is it gives you examples of what you can do during your social phases for every class. No more the dumb fighter sitting in the back because they just, you know, they got a shit charisma and it's their dump stat. They can definitely engage with more parts of the game in a meaningful way and potentially succeed. And that's great. The more opportunities you have to, it doesn't mean that the people who are awesome at those things won't excel. It just means that there's more opportunities for people to be engaged in most scenes. No one's sitting back checking their phone. It's like, well, it's a chatty scene. Let's let the bard do that. So that's really, really cool. So who's this for? I think for people who, I'm going to try and not think of, I guess I mentioned from the outset why I have come to this. You know, for me, PF1 was just, there's too much crunch in there for what you were getting out in the end. So I did love a lot of the ideas and a lot of the material for PF1, but it just was, it was too rigid of a game for my likings. I would never go back to D&D 4th because the tactical play is fucking awful. It takes forever. It's fun and there's interesting decisions, but it takes too darn long. I would never go. I'm not never, but I don't like running 5th edition because I feel like it's a half-assed way between like the Pathfinder complexity and the simplicity and lack of options with old school play. I just love this game. This hits for me the really great middle point where there's exciting play, good options for players. I can't wait for this to get in the hands of my players when it finally releases. Because again, at the time of recording, it's still a couple days before the PDF is available. But so who's it for? If you, I guess one more thing I want to say as well too, just in a big picture on this. So one of the things that you may come away with looking at the size of this monstrosity is that, good God, that is a massive game. There's way too much shit to learn in here. But what I want to remind you, if you made it all the way through this video, is how small that section was for the tactical rules. What this does, very much like Starfinder, is it front loads the options for the players, but streamlines the options for the DM. It is very easy to do encounter building. It is very easy to just be focusing your attention on designing interesting encounters and so forth. Yeah, you're going to have a chore building NPCs, but what game will you not do that in? You know, Starfinder, I don't do that, but in Ash, I do that. In Pathfinder, I do that. In D&D 5th, I do that, unless I'm using a preset, set of stats, in which case I can reskin from this, or I can steal stuff from my adventure paths. So what this is for, I think, is if you're a DM who does enjoy your crunch, who enjoys a good tactical game, enjoys a good game of that, but also likes, likes the having codified rules for running, what were skill challenges in D&D 4th. If you're not familiar with 4th edition D&D, skill challenges were this kind of game mechanic they introduced where very, very simplistic is you roll a certain amount of successes before a certain amount of failures. One Ring has incorporated that into their mechanics. At its base, the way they do social rules and whatnot, social encounters, is just a kind of skill challenge that's been tweaked. It has carried over to 5th, but I don't think it's not like a baked-in part of the game. It's kind of an optional thing. But if you enjoyed that stuff, if you enjoy, like, say, extended tests in any of the 2D20 games, or some of the optional rules that have come out since in, say, Genesis or Fantasy Flight, that this has the bones of that kind of game. And when the Game Mastery Guide comes out, I imagine we're going to have a ton of examples to steal from. I can tell you there's already some examples in the adventure paths that are coming out. And if you're someone who I don't know. I mean, like if any of what I've said sounds interesting, even just checking out the action economy to me feels unlike any other kind of D&D I've ever played. It feels liberating. It makes shields and casting spells feel so much more tangible because you're taking up those actions than any other game, that it just feels more visceral than what it did in any other game. It's more intuitive than I think any other version of D&D I've played. That's including fifth. I mean, fifth has its fiddly bonus action thing that is kind of weird. So I prefer this to that. But again, like I don't mean to comparing apples and apples here. If you are a player who likes having, likes making those decisions, likes kind of like sweating over things and theory crafting, this is going to be a great game for you. And in addition, because of the retraining thing, you can always change your character. You don't have to wait to a new level. You don't have to wait for the DM permission or something like that. It's just something you can do in the course of play. So I love that because it encourages you to try stuff out, see how it fits, either with your character or with your party or whatever. If you don't like it, you go back and retrain, and there you go. You try something different. It's another one of the ways that the game says yes. And I'm trying to think who else. I guess maybe at the end of this, I said at the outset, like before I got into actually running the game or reading the game and then running the game, I was like, who's this for? People are playing 5th edition and if they like their 1st edition Pathfinder, they're not there. Well, the wrong way to think of this game is as a natural outgrowth from Pathfinder. I think this is a very different game. The amount of changes that were made to this, where they kept no sacred cows. There's nothing that's in here that I feel it's in here because it was in Pathfinder 1. And that's a really brave design decision, to say like, look, just because it is something that happened in a previous edition, we're not carrying it over. That's not to say that the game is not recognizable as a D20 game or as a Pathfinder, successor, but it's a different animal in and of itself. So if you really genuinely didn't like Pathfinder, I would definitely not use that as a strike against this game. If you're looking for something that has a little more tactical complexity, and I don't mean that in a sense that it'll bog down the game. I mean regular character decisions you get to make at each level, and if you're playing with players who, really like, they don't want to have to interface with the rules, because we all play with them. I got players who they play pre-gens and then I make the decisions for them as they go up because they don't really care. They just want to play the game. Well, because of the way feats work in this, I think it is a lot more enticing and a lot more accessible. So even if you got players who are adverse to that kind of theory crafting stuff, telling them, here's your 4 options. Do you want to attack, be able to make a 2-action attack that does more damage, but it does use up 2 of your actions? Do you want to be better with a shield? Do you want to be a better archer, or do you want to do whatever? It's you don't have to do a lot of work to make the options for the character generation understandable. And the rulebook does a good job of that anyway. So what is to say that, even if your feeling is, look, 5e is the right level of complexity, I would give it a look. And I guess at the end, I mean, this is, I think gamers are often, evangelical to a certain degree. And I just adore this game. I love reading it. I love running it. I love thinking of what I'm going to be doing with it, both for tactical encounters, for social encounters, for exploration, how I can tweak things to suit my own sensibilities for it, how I can use it for different settings. I really, really love it. And I'm really excited to see what the players do. Every person who I've run this for, and the players that I run this for are often coming from my same perspective, from the same type of old school players. They don't want to have a lot of math to be doing and whatever else. So I think that it's something worth taking a look at. Now, the people who absolutely, it's not. If your bag is basic D&D and you don't need anything more than that, you don't need any more complexity, this is probably not going to be for you. I'm not sure that it's such a different animal. It's not going to supplant that style of play. So it's not going to be that. If you are coming from I honestly don't know how Pathfinder players will react. I'm not one of them, so I can't really say. What I can say is one of my diehard Pathfinder players, I can't wait to run it for him, because everything I told him about, he's eager to get it to the table. It'll not replace his game, you know, and like for me, this is not going to replace my other games as well. Like, I'm not going to stop running Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerer's Hyperborea for this because I love that old school feel for that type of play. But what I can tell you is for traditional fantasy, I am going to be running this nonstop. My regular Wednesday, Friday games are going to be all Pathfinder 2nd Edition for the foreseeable future because I just want to keep playing this game. So I guess as a closing, that's what you can take as your you know, your takeaway maybe in framing all I've said so far is that I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who is extremely skeptical, but over the course of running this game have progressively come to love more and more and more things about it. I can't wait to see where they go with this game. You know, when the playtest came out, I kept comparing it to the things that PF1 had that this one didn't. Where's my Gunslinger? Where's my, you know, Oracle? Where's my whatever, you know, Magus? I don't think that way anymore. Maybe it's because like after a year of running old school games, I'm not thinking of those in the foremost of my mind. But boy, oh boy, like for any style of traditional D&D game, this is going to give you a wealth of incredibly interesting things to run a very, very fun and exciting and immersive gamist style game, you know? So yeah, so that's who it's for, and probably who it's not for as well too. Pathfinder 1 players, I'd be interested to hear. I honestly don't know, you know, what it is you're going to like about it, not like about it. What I can say is I genuinely hope that this finds a massive audience. You know, I know that I heard today a friend told me that it's something like 67% of games played on Fantasy Grounds are D&D 5e, and something like 53% of games played currently on Roll20 are D&D 5e. And that's awesome. I mean, I imagine that is more a reflection of just how many people have joined and how many people are playing D&D, because it's such a huge cultural movement at this point too. But I really, really hope that this game finds a solid core of support and finds fans who love it. Because right now, what I saw, again, like the reason I wanted to shoot this because it seems like such a weird, no one's like banging the drums, trumpeting the arrival of this game the way that a lot of other games, like every other game that I follow, like indie game, whatever, you know, big release, there's tons and tons of people who are raving and enthusiastic about seeing this thing come out. And I want to be at least one of the people who is enthusiastic and raving that this thing is coming out because I love it. And I can't wait to see. And I should also say it's great coming in at the beginning of a game, you know. This video may not age well in that sense, but I mean, getting on at the beginning of a game and then seeing it evolve is one of my favorite things. And if for no other reason, this is an exciting moment because I can't wait to start seeing how this game evolves over the years to come. You know, the gods of Pathfinder permitting. So anyway, this video, I have no idea how long it's gone, but I can tell it's getting dark outside. So I've probably been talking for quite a while. I can see that there's a crap ton of people who are talking in chat as well too. Forgive me, folks, for not getting into those. What I'll do is I'll go through the chat afterwards, and I will try and respond to those as I go through. If there's specific mechanical questions, I will try and respond to those. Though I mean, the book's going to be out shortly, so I imagine that might be answered there. But yeah. Oh, and if you're curious too, these are the special edition versions that I ordered here. These are the limited edition, whatever. They got that faux red cover on it. They've got the perfect binding in it as well with stitching rather than whatever. And there's the two things in it. These are awesome. They feel great to carry. I'm a complete lunatic, so I've ordered copies of the regular editions because I'm a fucking hoarder. So I'm gonna get those too, but these will be the ones I use all the time. Yeah, that's why these might look different from the ones you might see in the Amazon or whatever. So anyway, that is my my overview of Pathfinder 2e and probably my kind of, you know, poorly veiled pitch for why I think that this game is absolutely worth a look. For my money, it's such a fun game. It's a thrilling game to play. I think it supports all the different stages that you want from a fantasy game. And I find myself, you know, that I really cannot wait to get it back to the table after we finish each session. And the 2 or 3 sessions I've run of it so far, every single one of them has run late, which is very not like me. I'm usually very regimented on my time. So anyway, I will stop my pitch here. For those who've been watching as well too, for those in chat, my apologies for not getting in and talking about responding to your text. I really did want to try and focus on getting the video shot and keeping my discussion coherent, though I know it probably wasn't. I may have forgotten some stuff as well too. So if I did, or if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about this overview, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will endeavor to respond in a timely fashion. Alternatively, you can reach me on Dungeon Musings or on Twitter at Dungeon Musings. You can also find me or shoot me an email. My email address is Dungeon Musings. Anyway, thanks again for everyone who sat through my overview and evangelical pitch for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I hope that you do give the game at least a look once you're able to access the free rules online, or you try and sit in the game. We're going to be running this on the channel, continue running this on the channel for the foreseeable future, because I am having so much fun with this. So if nowhere else, you're certainly welcome to watch us. But, you know, if you want to see a more professional thing too, the Glass Cannon podcast is the official Pathfinder, what do you call it? Or one of the official Pathfinder actual plays. And I know they're running Pathfinder 2nd Edition now. So if you want to see a more polished and slick production than what we offer around these parts, definitely check that out and see how it looks for you. Or you can listen to them and download their play. Anyway, thank you everybody for listening, for sitting through my my very lengthy overview. I hope you found it informative, and I hope it helped you decide whether or not giving Pathfinder 2nd Edition a look is worth a look for you. So anyway, until next time, thanks again, and happy gaming.